You ever look at a monastery and think peaceful, right? Like some medieval Airbnb for your soul? A quiet retreat where monks float down stone corridors humming hymns, sipping herbal teas, and communing with God under golden sunlight. Yeah. No. Tonight on the Drowsy Historian, we're cracking open the wooden gates of a 13th century Hungarian monastery, and trust me, you're not going to want to check in. Because while the church promised eternal peace, the reality was an unpaid internship in misery, ruled by guilt, grime, and Gregorian chants that never ended. This isn't your average medieval tale. It's hunger wrapped in holiness, lice cloaked in linen, and silence so loud it makes your ears ring. So fluff your haystack pillow, pull that scratchy wool blanket tight, and get ready to tuck in. Not into bed, but into one of the most misunderstood lives of the Middle Ages. Chapter 1. Before the bells ring. A dawn of silence and cold. Let's get one thing straight. You're not waking up. You're being woken. There's no sunrise gently touching your cheeks. No birds chirping some medieval lullaby. Instead, it's 3045 a.m. and a freezing Hungarian wind is slicing through the monastery like it's got a vendetta. Somewhere deep in the stone belly of the abbey, a bell shrieks once long and slow, and every soul in the dormitory lurches upright like puppets yanked by guilt strings. Meet Brother Martin. He's 24, hasn't spoken more than 30 words all week, and his bed is a wooden plank with some straw on top, because comfort breeds sin, and sin is just too easy when you're warm. He rolls out of his cot, hits the ground with bare knees, and mutters a Latin prayer that translates roughly to, "Forgive me for the dreams I didn't control." Yes, even your subconscious gets judged here. Across from him, Brother Tamas, the elder monk, groans as he straightens his spine, which is a miracle in itself, given its shape more like a question mark than a spine. He's been doing this routine for 41 years and still flinches when his feet hit the cold flagstones. There are no fireplaces in the sleeping quarters. Fire is warmth, warmth is comfort. And comfort, well, you already know the drill. The rule of St. Benedict Hungary's spiritual user manual of the time explicitly warns against softness. The idea is to strip everything away that could distract you from God, which apparently includes insulation, privacy, personal identity, and any sense of self-worth. Now, let's talk clothes. You don't get dressed. You were already sleeping in your robes, one set, unwashed, for months. It smells like wet sheep and burnt cabbage. The robe is heavy, made of scratchy wool, and stiff in all the wrong places. And it still doesn't cover your toes. You shuffle into the chapel with the others. Nobody talks, not even a whisper. The only sound is the rhythmic dragging of sandals on stone and the occasional cough, which, let's be honest, is probably tuberculosis. Silence is sacred, but also mandatory. You don't just keep quiet, you sign oaths for it. Here's a fun fact. Monasteries had punishment benches for monks who so much as sneezed during matins. And no, that's not sarcasm. Brother Istvan once coughed during the Psalms and spent 3 days fasting in the crypt next to the tomb of a saint who may or may not have died of the plague. And then there's the prayer. The first service of the day, Matins, begins in total darkness. The candles flicker but give off no real heat. You chant psalms in Latin, dozens of them, back to back. Some monks, like Brother Tamas, have them memorized. Others just mumble along, hoping nobody notices. If your voice cracks or you miss a beat, you get a glare from the cantor that could melt iron. And iron doesn't melt easily, but your spirit does. By the time the sun's even thinking of rising, you've already kneeled for an hour, bowed 6 times, and recited enough scripture to make your vocal cords beg for mercy. And you're starving. Breakfast? Oh no, not yet. You've got Lord's next. Another round of prayers. But here's where things get spicy. Lord's happens just as the horizon starts to pale. And that's when you see your breath in the chapel air curling like incense. But that's just your body reminding you it's alive. Barely. Critics of monasticism often called it voluntary imprisonment. But that's unfair to prisoners. At least they got a cell and sometimes bread. You? You get self-imposed suffering with a side of smugness from older monks who think starvation is a competition. And did we mention the lice? Every monk has them. Your robe is their kingdom. Your scalp, their battlefield. But don't you dare scratch during service. It's a sin of distraction. And distraction, of course, leads to damnation. So you endure it, the cold, the crawling, the emptiness in your stomach and your heart. All of it. Because the only thing worse than being a monk in medieval Hungary is failing at being one. But don't worry, the day's just begun. Next up, a hot meal? Nope. Welcome to the kitchen of despair and the communal bowl of mystery gruel. You shuffle from the chapel in a slow-moving line, each step echoing against damp stone walls that have absorbed centuries of groans, chants, and regrets. The light has shifted now. Thin fingers of grey dawn slipping through narrow stained-glass slits, casting the hallway in splotches of pale red and gold. The beauty of it doesn't matter. You're too cold, too sore, and too hungry to care, and that's probably the point. In a medieval Hungarian monastery, anything remotely pleasurable is suspicious. Joy is a gateway sin. Now comes the meal, though calling it that is a generous stretch. You file into the refectory, essentially a stone box filled with echoes and judgment. Wooden benches flank a long table that could have once been a tree or perhaps a medieval punishment plank. It's hard to tell since comfort is never part of the design. No one's allowed to speak. The rule of St. Benedict requires that meals be eaten in silence while one monk reads scripture aloud from a raised pulpit. So even your chewing comes with a side of guilt. What's on the menu? Surprise. It's gruel. Again. A colourless sludge of mashed barley, water, and something that might once have been a vegetable. It's served lukewarm in shared wooden bowls, which are passed down the line like sacrificial offerings. Brother Martin stares into the bowl as if expecting it to reveal some greater truth. It doesn't. Just a clump of soggy oats clinging to the spoon like it too wishes to escape. If you're lucky, there's a crust of bread stale, of course, because fresh bread implies indulgence. And indulgence is sin's favourite footstool. No meat, not ever. Meat inflames the senses, or so the abbots claim. Fish? Occasionally, but only the dried kind that smells like regret and has the texture of leather parchment. The idea is not to feed the body, but to humble it, which they achieve with near-violent consistency. Brother Thomas, the elder monk with the crooked back, eats slowly, deliberately, like he's made peace with the blandness. But even he winces when he hits a pebble in the gruel, a common hazard when grains are poorly sifted. Dental care isn't exactly robust in the 13th century. A cracked tooth here means a month of pus and prayer. Once the bowls are empty, and you better believe they're licked clean because food waste is not only unholy, it's punishable. You all rise in unison, bow, and shuffle out, still in silence. Always in silence. Your thoughts are supposed to fill the void. But what if your thoughts aren't holy? What if they wander, as they often do, toward warmth, sleep, or a dream of not living like this? The answer? More prayer, more penance, more denial. Now the work begins. Contrary to romanticised tales, monks weren't just praying all day, they laboured hard. The Hungarian countryside was unforgiving, and monasteries had to be self-sufficient. That meant fields needed tending, animals needed feeding, and gardens had to be maintained with a precision bordering on obsession. Even the compost had rules. Brother Martin heads to the herb garden, fingers already stiff from the cold. He's tasked with weeding, a seemingly simple job, until you realise that some of those weeds are medicinal herbs, and mistaking one for the other can mean the difference between healing and a very holy funeral. Monastic libraries existed, yes, but don't picture a cosy room of candlelit scholars and velvet robes. It was a freezing chamber where ink froze in winter and candles barely held their flame. Copying scripture was part devotion, part survival ritual. The ink was handmade, often using gall nuts, iron salts and wine. That's right, monks used wine for ink but weren't allowed to drink it. Irony? Oh, they'd call it purity. If your penmanship was poor, you'd be punished. If your Latin faltered, you'd be corrected. Publicly, harshly. Mistakes weren't simply errors. They were interpreted as signs of spiritual weakness. There are records of monks being forced to fast for days just for spelling a saint's name incorrectly. Imagine skipping 3 meals because your hand slipped while writing Gregorius. And lest you think this life made them saints, spoiler alert, it didn't. Monks were just as prone to pettiness, gossip, and ego as any average villager. Only now, it came wrapped in cloaks of righteousness. Brother Istvan once accused another monk of pride because his chant voice was too melodic. Yes, melodic. That was the scandal. He was told to chant flatter, to avoid seducing the ear. Imagine living in a world where sounding too nice gets you excommunicated from choir. At mid-morning, there's a short break. Not for rest, don't be absurd, but for more prayer. The 3rd hour. Another bout of chanting psalms you already mumbled at 4 a.m. By now your knees feel like shattered porcelain, your hands are cracked. And your thoughts? Well, you're not sure if they're yours anymore. That's the point. The monastic system wasn't designed to nurture your individuality. It was built to strip it away, one rule, one fast, one sleepless night at a time. So why did they do it? Some truly believed. Others were born into it. Many were second sons sent off because the eldest inherited the farm and the youngest wasn't smart enough to be a priest. Some monks sought redemption. Others sought escape from war, from sin, from themselves. But few ever found peace. Because peace in the monastery was a reward you were never quite holy enough to deserve. And that's just the morning. Coming up next, how to freeze, itch, and chant simultaneously. Welcome to the long and scratchy afternoon of the Hungarian cloister. Chapter 2. Bread, Broth, and Bitter Air. The Morning Meal. By the time the monks finish their 3rd hour prayers, the sun has dared to lift its head, though only barely, and with little enthusiasm. It casts a thin, reluctant light across the monastery's uneven cobblestones, painting everything in the kind of grey that makes you question if morning is even worth it. The cold, of course, remains unwavering. Sunlight in medieval Hungary doesn't mean warmth. It simply means your shadow has returned to mock you. Brother Martin rubs his cracked knuckles together, careful not to show discomfort. Pain is to be worn like a medal here, an invisible badge of virtue. You suffer, therefore you are holy. Or at least closer to holy than the poor souls outside these walls, who get to eat pork and laugh in public. Speaking of food, the next activity on the sacred schedule involves what the monastery generously calls the morning meal. Generous, because what's served wouldn't satisfy a medieval rat. The monks file into the refectory once again, this time greeted not by silence, but by a cold draught wafting in through a loose stone somewhere in the wall. They sit at long wooden tables, each monk leaving the exact amount of space between him and the next, measured not by comfort, but by rule. There's a rule for everything. Posture, eye contact, spoon angle, even how long you may chew before swallowing. The point of the meal isn't nourishment, it's discipline. A bell rings, and the lector ascends to his pulpit. He clears his throat, opens a worn leather-bound text, and begins reciting scripture. Loud, monotone, emotionless. The perfect background music to choking down a ladleful of boiled barley water and a wedge of yesterday's bread. And if you're lucky, if the stars align and the cook didn't offend the abbot, you might get a sprinkle of dried leek or a shred of cabbage floating like a lost soul in your bowl. But don't be fooled. This wasn't poverty out of necessity. This was engineered asceticism, designed suffering. The idea was to weaken the body so the spirit might rise. A noble notion, perhaps, until you realize the spirit doesn't do much rising when the body is battling malnutrition, hypothermia, and intestinal parasites all at once. The food itself is, well, food is a strong word. Imagine oatmeal without salt, milk, or texture, just grey. The monks eat slowly, silently. The only sounds are wooden spoons scraping wooden bowls, and the lector's voice droning on about humility while your stomach growls like an angry peasant. Nobody reacts. Hunger is normal. Suffering is expected. If you even blink too dramatically, you risk being assigned extra prayers. Or worse, latrine duty. Let's talk about bread. The monastery bakes its own, of course, using flour made from coarse ground grains that haven't been sieved properly. Tiny pebbles often sneak in. Chew carefully or say goodbye to your molars. There's no dentistry in the cloister. A lost tooth is just one more opportunity for spiritual reflection, or as Brother Tamars once said with a toothless grin, each missing tooth brings you closer to heaven because there's less of you to sin. The bread is handed out in palm-sized pieces, barely enough to quiet the acid curling in your stomach. It's hard, crusty and cold. No butter, no oil. Butter is a luxury, and luxury is the devil's throw pillow. The monks dip it in their broth, not for flavour, but because otherwise it's like gnawing on old furniture. You eat slowly, not to savour, but to extend the illusion that you are being fed. Some monks, those who've been here for decades, develop an almost philosophical way of chewing, as if they're contemplating the nature of suffering with every bite. By mid-meal, the room is filled with the faint scent of damp wool, old garlic, and something unidentifiable that might be dried turnip. No one speaks, no one smiles. Not because they're sad necessarily, just because smiling is discouraged unless it's directed at God, and even then you're advised to keep it subtle. And yet, somehow, the hierarchy still seeps in. At the head of the table sits the abbot, who, in this world of deprivation, enjoys minor privileges. His bowl is deeper, his bread is slightly softer. His seat has a cushion, a thin one mind you, but a cushion nonetheless. The monks pretend not to notice. Envy is a sin after all, but you can feel it. An unspoken awareness that even in spiritual equality, some are just more equal than others. The lector continues reading, now transitioning from Psalms to the Rule of St. Benedict. Today's section happens to be about gluttony and the danger of desire. He reminds the brothers that longing for rich food weakens the soul. Brother Martin glances down at his watery gruel and wonders what soul-shattering crime a bowl of lamb stew would be. He's never tasted lamb stew. He probably never will. As the meal ends, a small brass bell rings again. Everyone stands in unison. The bowls are collected. The lector concludes his reading with a verse about obedience. Then the monks bow together, silently acknowledging the shared misery that binds them tighter than any oath. Their stomachs are only slightly less empty, but their guilt is thoroughly fed. After the meal, the younger monks clean the refectory, while the older ones are sent to their daily assignments. It's not random. Tasks are rotated in a system designed by a previous abbot who, judging by the complexity, may have missed his calling as a tax auditor. Brother Martin is assigned to the animal pens today. He'll be feeding pigs, chickens, and a goat that seems to hate everyone except the abbot's cat. But before labour begins, there's another chapel session. A brief prayer of thanksgiving for the meal just consumed. Yes, the one that tasted like damp cloth and old despair. Gratitude is mandatory. Expressing discontent is dangerous. The monk who once called the barley gruel the devil's porridge was sent to fast for a week and banned from kitchen duty permanently, which frankly sounds like a win. The morning ends as it began, cold, hungry, and weighed down by the invisible hand of enforced holiness. The monks return to their workstations, muscles stiff, minds half numb, and bodies aching. But none of it will be mentioned aloud. In this place, the silence eats more than you do. And as the sun climbs higher into the winter sky, casting a faint light on cracked windows and frost-covered fields, the monastery grinds on slow, deliberate, and inescapably human. Because here, in the cloistered heart of Hungary, even God's servants can't escape the bitter taste of bread and broth. The monastery kitchen, if you could call it that, wasn't a place of warmth or welcome. It was a dim, soot-stained stone room that reeked of wet wood, old onions, and the quiet defeat of a cook who'd long stopped trying to impress anyone, including God. Brother Janos, the monk responsible for feeding this army of ascetics, stood at a blackened hearth stirring a massive iron pot with a stick that doubled as a walking staff. He didn't look up when Brother Martin entered with a stack of dirty bowls. There was no "thank you," no nod. Gratitude was not part of the kitchen's liturgy. Behind him, a younger novice dragged a burlap sack of root vegetables, half of them rotten, all of them bruised. Supplies came irregularly from the surrounding villages, who themselves had little to spare. Trade was allowed but limited, and the monastery preferred donations. What wasn't given freely was expected to be grown, and in the frostbitten fields of northern Hungary, growing anything beyond cabbage and gilt was a miracle in itself. Wheat, when available, was rationed like a relic. Barley was the staple, cheaper, coarser, and better at reminding you that pleasure is for sinners. Lentils were a luxury. Carrots? Only if they didn't freeze in the root cellar first. Salt was precious. Fat was rare. Butter? Blasphemy. The meals weren't meant to satisfy. They were meant to teach you the virtue of emptiness. A full belly, after all, breeds sloth. And sloth is one hell away from gluttony. After cleaning the bowls, Brother Martin was sent to the animal yard, a space behind the refectory that functioned as both pen and penance. The pigs here were no ordinary swine. They were the monastery's most honest creatures, loud, dirty, and unapologetically hungry. Their squeals echoed off the stone like a choir of the damned. Feeding them required hauling buckets of leftover slop that, ironically, often looked more substantial than what the monks ate themselves. It was a strange hierarchy. Men starved for salvation, pigs fattened for tithes. In the next pen over, a pair of goats chewed thoughtfully on straw, each one looking smarter than some of the novices. And just beyond that, chickens scratched the frozen earth for insects long dead. The irony wasn't lost on Martin. Life inside the monastery was meant to be elevated, separate from the worldly suffering outside. But here, in the muck and the silence, surrounded by animals who ate better and lived freer, it was hard not to feel like something had been lost in translation. As the morning dragged on, a snow flurry drifted in from the east, dusting the courtyard in white. It was beautiful in the way that cold things often are, distant, indifferent, pristine. The wind found every gap in every robe, slipping in like a silent rebuke. Hands went numb, lips cracked, but still the work continued. There were stables to clean, firewood to split, herbs to sort, and manuscripts to repair. Each task assigned not for efficiency but for humility. If it humbles, it helps. That was the monastic motto, unofficial but ironclad. Meanwhile, inside the library, a different kind of hunger brewed. Not for food, but for order. The scriptorium was one of the few heated spaces in the monastery, and even then only barely. It existed more as a fortress of discipline than a sanctuary of learning. Monks here copied texts by hand, religious treatises, Latin psalters, hagiographies of saints who starved themselves into sainthood. The ink was temperamental, the quills fickle, the lighting appalling. But the expectation of perfection never waned. Brother Istvan, one of the monastery's more educated scribes, prided himself on producing flawless pages. He also prided himself on pointing out everyone else's mistakes. A single smudge on parchment could set a monk back hours, sometimes days. Corrections weren't simply frowned upon, they were interpreted as moral failings. If your script faltered, your faith must have too. One monk once ruined a half-finished manuscript by sneezing ink across it. He spent a month in enforced silence, and that was the merciful punishment. But it wasn't just the physical hardships, it was the endless layering of rules, rituals, and readings that formed a psychological fog. The rule of St. Benedict was memorized, meditated upon, quoted at meals, whispered during punishments, and wielded like a theological club. It told you when to wake, when to wash, when to fast, when to bow, when to confess, when to labour, and when to feel guilty for not feeling guilty enough. And yes, confessions happened often. Not to clear the soul, but to maintain the system. You confessed impure thoughts, envy, anger, even dreams, especially dreams. If you dreamed of food, it was gluttony. If you dreamed of a woman, it was lust. If you dreamed of warm weather and laughter, it was pride. Every corner of the mind was subject to inspection. Privacy, like pleasure, had no place within these walls. Brother Martin, like many novices, learned quickly to confess preemptively. Even if he hadn't sinned, it was safer to admit to wandering thoughts than to pretend holiness. Confession was currency. It kept the hierarchy intact. Older monks confessed less. The abbot, rarely and always with a tone that made it sound like even his flaws were God-approved. By the noon hour, the bell rang again. Not for food, heavens no, but for sext, the sixth canonical hour of prayer. You paused work, washed without soap of course, filed into the chapel, and began again. Psalms, hymns, kneeling, silence, guilt. Rinse and repeat. The day had passed in tasks so repetitive they blurred into a single grey smear. And through it all, the food, what little there was, clung to your ribs like ash. You were never quite full, never quite warm, never quite at rest. That was the point. Life here wasn't about living. It was about dying, slowly, piously, invisibly. And if you're wondering whether all this effort made the monks holy, the answer is complicated. Some became gentle and wise, others became bitter, rigid, or quietly cruel. A few snapped entirely. There are records, quietly buried of course, of monks wandering into the forest naked, claiming they'd heard angels. Others were quietly locked away in crypt cells until their delusions passed, or until they did. But the system persisted. Because once enough people believe that suffering is sacred, it stops looking like torture and starts looking like tradition. And tradition, especially in a monastery, is harder to kill than sin itself. As the bell tolls once more, and the shadows begin to stretch across the cloister, Brother Martin looks up at the clouds and wonders, not whether God is watching, but whether he approves of what he sees. Chapter 3. Copy or Perish. The Scriptorium's Silent Torture. By the time Brother Martin drags his feet toward the Scriptorium, he's already prayed 5 times, eaten barely once, and aged a decade in spirit. His fingers are still raw from morning labour. His back is locked in that lovely medieval S shape that only stone benches and manual labour can gift you, and his stomach has finally stopped complaining, not because it's satisfied, but because it has given up hope. That's when the real trial of the day begins. The Scriptorium, to the outsider, might seem like the monastery's jewel, a place of scholarship, illumination, and sacred quiet. It is quiet, yes, but not the poetic kind. It's the kind of silence that weighs on your ribs, the kind that hums in your ear like a mosquito sent by God to test your soul. You enter, and immediately your breath slows, your eyes narrow, and your spine involuntarily straightens, like it knows mistakes will be punished. Inside, long rows of wooden desks stretch from wall to wall like pews for the damned. They are narrow, splintered, and cruelly slanted, designed not for comfort, but for control. Monks sit hunched over them like penitents at confession, quills in hand, eyes narrowed, mouths tight. The only sounds are the soft scrape of parchment, the occasional sniff, and the ever-so-slight creak of a wooden joint protesting its owner's poor posture. Brother Martin takes his seat at the end of the row. His desk is assigned, no choice allowed. Choice is chaos. Order is the word of God. His inkwell is half empty, the quill dulled from yesterday's toil. He quickly inspects it and prays it holds. If not, he'll need to sharpen it with the dull knife tucked in his robe. A risky task, since slipping and blotting the manuscript could earn him a fast day and a few hours of silent shaming from Brother Istvan. Ah yes, Brother Istvan, the senior scribe. He occupies the seat closest to the window where the natural light is best and the cold slightly more tolerable. His robes are patched with care, his script famously elegant, and his glare potent enough to turn ink sour. He has never smiled. It's rumoured he once corrected the abbot's Latin mid-sermon. The abbot forgave him. God might not have. Martin begins. Today's assigned text is a collection of sermons from St. Bernard of Clairvaux Delicate, flowing Latin with the occasional theological landmine. One misplaced non can reverse a sentence's meaning from God is merciful to God is not merciful, which would be, shall we say, a doctrinal problem. Every stroke of the pen is a moral responsibility. Every line, a test of faith and patience. The ink stinks. It's a homemade brew of iron salts, vinegar, and what might be spoiled wine. It cots easily in the cold and stains fingers for days. If you smudge the page, you start over. If you sneeze, God help you. Literally. There is no forgiveness for bodily functions in the scriptorium. Martin once watched a novice be reassigned to cellar duty for a week after a hiccup ruined a page of St. Augustine. The lesson? Hold your breath, or suffer. And then there's the handwriting itself. Not just any script will do. Monasteries prided themselves on their particular calligraphic style. Beneventan, Caroline minuscule, Gothic. Hungarian monasteries, especially those under Cluniac or Cistercian influence, often favoured rigid, angular styles that looked more like runes than readable text. The spacing had to be perfect, each letter balanced, uniform, holy. A crooked M wasn't a mistake, it was a spiritual blemish. Some even believed demons could slip through poorly formed letters. Hours pass. The sun arcs across the narrow stained glass window, painting slow-moving shadows on the cold stone floor. Your knees ache from being bent. Your back protests. Your fingers, frozen and ink-stained, begin to tremble. But stopping is not allowed. Breaks are not scheduled. You may pause to pray. That's it. And even then, only if your prayer doesn't distract the monk next to you. By midday, Martin has finished 2 folios. It's not enough. Brother Istvan has done 3 and is already illuminating the capital letters with powdered gold leaf. Martin watches him for a second too long. A mistake. The older monk clears his throat. A dry, sharp sound that carries more judgment than an entire courtroom. Martin looks back to his page, ashamed. His next stroke slips. The ink runs. A small blot forms on the margin. It's not fatal, but it's visible. He doesn't cry. That would be weakness. He simply breathes, presses a cloth to the ink to stop the bleeding, and moves on. He knows what comes next. A review by the supervisor. Brother Adorjan, a man so pious he once chastised a visiting abbot for speaking too cheerfully. He will inspect every page at day's end, and if the blot is deemed distracting, Martin will have to redo the page. No appeals, no mercy. The cold intensifies as clouds gather outside. The monastery's firewood is rationed, used sparingly, mostly for cooking and the infirmary. The scriptorium gets none. Warmth breeds comfort. Comfort dulls vigilance. Vigilance is the currency of monks, so the cold stays. It creeps up your legs, stiffens your hands, fogs your breath. Still, you write. And for what? That's the question that creeps in sometimes, like a draft through a cracked shutter. What is the purpose of copying the same texts, day after day, word after word, in a language only a handful can read? Most villagers outside these walls can't even spell their names. Some monks quietly, secretly wonder if this entire enterprise is just spiritual busywork. But they don't say it aloud. Those who ask too many questions find themselves reassigned to the gardens or the latrines, places where the silence isn't sacred, just pungent. But deep down, most believe, or want to, the act of copying is a form of worship. To write is to preserve the word of God. To perfect one's hand is to discipline the soul. Each line is a prayer. Each manuscript a monument to obedience. Whether that obedience is to God, the abbot, or the invisible machinery of tradition, that's harder to say. As evening draws near, the room darkens. Candles are lit, their flames flickering like tired thoughts. One monk dozes briefly. His quill drops, clatters to the stone. Everyone hears it. No one reacts. But tomorrow he'll be the last one assigned supper. Quiet punishments are best. They leave no scars, just better posture. Brother Martin flexes his fingers, his wrist aches, his eyes burn, his knees scream. But the page is nearly done. Another sermon, another soul saved through ink. He dips the quill again, wipes a flake of dried gall from the nib, and continues. Because in the scriptorium you don't stop until the words run out. Or you do. Evening light was a joke in the scriptorium. The few slit windows let in little more than a watery suggestion of sun, and by the time it got to the room, it was about as useful as the abbot's sermons on joy. Candles were lit now. Not lavish candelabras, of course, but narrow tallow stubs stuck in cracked wooden holders, barely enough to illuminate your immediate space. The wax smelled faintly of sheep and regret, and their light flickered with every draught from the ancient walls. If you were lucky, your candle wouldn't sputter out mid-stroke. If you were unlucky, you'd be copying the Lord's Prayer in the dark, praying you didn't accidentally spell your own damnation. Brother Martin's spine had entered that special state of numbness reserved only for monks and coffin-bound corpses. His shoulders trembled, his eyes blurred, yet his hand moved on. It had become a mechanical gesture now. Dip, stroke, lift, breathe, repeat. He was no longer thinking about what he was writing. That had ceased an hour ago. His mind floated somewhere else entirely, a place that involved warm bread, actual chairs, and the absence of Brother Istvan's ever-hovering presence. But mistakes crept in when thoughts wandered, and Martin knew it. The last paragraph he'd copied included a repeated phrase, entirely unintentional. He noticed it only after the final period. Panic rose in his throat. He looked to his left. Istvan was glaring. Had he seen it? Probably. Would he mention it? Certainly. Not now, though. Now, he'd let the error simmer in Martin's chest like a boiling sin stew until inspection. Then he'd bring it up with a holy pause and a disapproving sigh so long it might as well be its own gospel. And then, just as the tension grew to a point where even the ink quivered, there came a sound. Sharp. Hollow. Final. The inspection bell. Every monk stopped writing. Pens laid down in unison. No words were exchanged. The room had become a wax museum of obedience. Brother Adorjan entered with the slow confidence of a man who'd made perfection his personal gospel. In his hands he held the inspection staff, a polished rod tipped with an iron knob, not used for beating, but somehow still menacing. He walked the rows, paused, lifted pages, tilted them toward the candlelight. His nose wrinkled at the scent of drying ink. His fingers never smudged. He reached Martin. 1 page, 2 pages, 3. Then he saw it, the repeated phrase. A tiny, near-invisible sin. Adorjan said nothing, only tapped the iron tip once against the parchment. A single sound. Soft. Condemning. Martin exhaled, inwardly cursed himself, and bowed his head. The punishment wouldn't be immediate. That wasn't how discipline worked here. No, here, guilt was steeped like tea. Left to brew, left to rot your peace. The page would be rewritten, the error noted. Martin would lose an evening meal or perhaps a half-night's sleep in extended prayers of reparation. You didn't fix mistakes with apologies. You fixed them with silence, penance, and the absence of comfort. Later that night, after the inspection and after Vespers, a slow, monotonous recitation of more psalms in a room colder than most graves, the monks were granted a short window of private contemplation, emphasis on short and private, not restful. Some went to the garden cloister to walk in slow, looping circles, murmuring scripture under their breath. Others sat on stone benches, staring into nothing, eyes haunted by guilt, or boredom, or perhaps just the 1,000-yard stare of a man who spent a decade writing about God without once speaking to another human like one. Brother Martin returned to the scriptorium, not to copy, but to stare. He stood by the shelves of completed manuscripts, stacked like trophies no one would read. Each one had taken months, years sometimes. Bound in leather, sealed with wax, stored in damp rooms no warmer than the hearts of the monks who made them, they were beautiful, sacred, useless in a way. Most of the peasants outside the monastery couldn't read their own names, let alone the Tractatus de Gratia Divina in 8 volumes. Still, The work continued, because copying was its own justification. The words kept the world together. He ran a finger down one spine, a familiar one, his first complete manuscript. The ink was lighter on those pages, his letters uneven. He had bled for those folios. Literally, his fingers had cracked, split open, stained the margins with tiny dots of crimson that had been carefully scraped out with a knife. He didn't feel proud of it, just hollow. Elsewhere, in the guest scriptorium, used rarely, mostly for visiting clergy, Brother Thomas sat, illuminating a capital letter with steady hands that had copied more words than most nobles read in a lifetime. His T for templum bloomed into a vine of gold and sapphire pigment, the tendrils curling into tiny beasts biting each other's tails. It was exquisite. It would be seen by no one. Tamars once said in a whisper only the ink could hear, "Beauty here is like breath on a window. You make it, and it disappears." And yet he worked on. By the time Compline, the final prayer of the day, arrived, the scriptorium was empty again, candles extinguished, ink pots sealed, quills laid gently beside stone inkwells like sleeping relics. The silence now wasn't oppressive. It was exhausted, the kind that comes after a day of servitude that no one asked for but everyone accepted. The monks filed into the chapel. Final chants were sung. The bell tolled once, marking the day's death. Then each monk returned to his cell. A wooden plank, a blanket, a bowl, a cross. Brother Martin lay in his robes, staring up at the ceiling. The ink was still under his fingernails. His hand twitched, unconsciously miming the motion of a quill. He didn't pray before sleep. He'd done enough of that. Outside, a frost coated the cloister garden. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, free, wild, unchained. Inside, monks dreamed not of heaven, but of clean hands, warmer robes, and perhaps, just once, a page with no mistakes. Chapter 4, Chanting Until You Choke, the weight of holy words. The morning bell didn't just ring, it bellowed, as if trying to summon not just the living monks from their wooden beds, but perhaps the bones of saints buried beneath the chapel floor. Brother Martin stirred before his body was ready, because it never was. His spine resisted the movement like it had signed a different monastic contract. Still, he rose, bowed in silence, and stepped onto the cold stone floor, same as yesterday, same as the day before, and the hundreds before that. Another day, another liturgical gauntlet. The rule of St. Benedict made no room for slow mornings. You didn't stretch, you didn't sigh, you didn't check the weather, because it was always the same, unforgiving. What you did was prepare for the divine office, again. The sacred symphony of chanting that bracketed every monk's day, from before dawn to after dark, was not optional, not shortened, not simplified. It was the heartbeat of monastic life. And in Hungary, under the rigid gaze of Latin orthodoxy and the biting winds of the Carpathians, that heartbeat came with pressure. Today was no feast day, no saints to celebrate, no miracles to recite. Which meant the standard 7 canonical hours, full length, with nothing festive to lift the tone. Just the droning murmur of exhausted men reciting the psalms in a language they understood only in pieces. Latin wasn't the native tongue of any monk here. It was sacred, yes, but alien. An echo of Roman perfection stuffed into their rural Hungarian mouths. Matins began in the chapel with the usual silence, not holy quiet, but the type born from mutual fatigue and resignation. The air was heavy with candle smoke, chilled breath, and the weight of obligation. The monks lined up in the choir stalls, faces pale, eyes sunken, lips already twitching toward their first verse. Then the chanting began. It wasn't singing, don't confuse it with beauty. Gregorian chant, in its purest form, is monotonal, restrained, stripped of any sense of joy. It's music, if music were invented by an ascetic with arthritis. The notes meander without climax, the rhythm steady, deliberate, almost cruel in its sameness. Brother Martin opened his mouth and let the syllables roll out, not as prayer, not as joy, but as obedience in audio form. Pater Noster, quies in caelis, each syllable dragged across dry vocal cords. The stone walls did what they always did. Amplified imperfections, bounced sound in odd directions, punished the weak notes. It wasn't about sounding good, it was about sounding together. If you wavered, if you pitched too high or too soft, if your timing was off, Brother Istvan would turn his head, just slightly. That slight turn was a condemnation. No one wanted the turn. There were no hymn books here. The psalms were memorized, or at least they were supposed to be. Martin still stumbled through the middle of Psalm 37, compensating by mouthing the words slightly behind the others, hoping to disappear into the communal voice. It was a trick all novices learned. Just don't be the one who falters audibly. God might forgive. The cantor won't. And yet, for all its suffocating repetition, chanting had purpose. It was the monk's spiritual labour, a form of self-emptying. You weren't meant to enjoy it. You were meant to lose yourself in it. That's why it went on for hours. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none could be missed. Even illness didn't excuse absence, unless you were unconscious or dead. And even then, someone would pray over your body before carrying on. Singing the same lines each day over and over had a strange effect on the mind. It blurred thoughts. Time dissolved. Past and future disappeared, leaving only the now, stretched into an endless chant of unchanging vowels. Martin often felt as if he lived outside time in that chapel, where nothing ever moved fast enough to be real. And still, beneath all the ritual, there was pressure, because there was no such thing as just showing up to the divine office. You had to embody it. You had to perform the humility, the devotion, the emptiness. You had to look like a vessel of God even when your mind was filled with fog and your belly with nothing. Mistakes had consequences. Once, a monk. Brother Andre had accidentally begun the antiphon on the wrong tone. Just a single note too high. The entire chant wobbled like a lopsided cart. Afterward, he was assigned midnight chapel sweeping for a month. It wasn't punishment, technically. It was corrective discipline. But when Brother Andre's eyes started twitching after the second week, even the abbot noticed. Even more insidious was the unspoken competition between monks. Who sang the clearest? Who had the strongest memory? Who needed the cheat parchment tucked in his sleeve? Brother Tummers, old but still sharp, sang with precision that bordered on surgical. He had survived 4 abbots, 2 invasions, and a roof collapse, but had never once missed a psalm. His presence in the choir was like a yardstick measuring everyone else's mediocrity. No one dared stand next to him during chanting. By the time terce rolled around late morning, the monks had chanted nearly 50 psalms. No, that is not a metaphor. 50, out loud, in perfect synchronization. In Latin, with no food since dawn. Martin's throat burned. His lips felt like parchment. His breath smelled like fermented barley and ink. And yet, there were more psalms waiting. Always more psalms. It was around this time that hallucinations started. Not visions of saints or angels, nothing glamorous, just strange warps in perception. The sensation that the stone beneath your feet had become softer, that your voice wasn't your own, that the walls were breathing. Chant-induced fatigue was real. Some monks called it divine dizziness. Others just called it the bend. It wasn't spiritual ecstasy, it was dehydration and starvation cloaked in theology. And then, the anthem for the dead. Every week, the monks recited a special chant for the souls of deceased brothers. It wasn't beautiful, it was haunting, monotone and minor. A funeral hymn performed by the living for those already in the crypt. Martin hated that one most, because as the names were intoned slowly, painfully, he could see them. Faces he'd passed in the corridor, hands that had once turned pages beside him, now just bones under flagstones. The dead didn't escape the chanting. Their names were still sung long after their voices had gone silent. By the time the last note fell, the chapel was a hollow, flickering cave. The candles had burned low. The monks bowed, one by one, and filed out. No applause, no joy, no relief. Just the unspoken understanding that they would do it all again. Later that day, then again tomorrow, and forever, until their own names made the funeral list. Martin left with a headache that felt shaped like a crucifix. His throat throbbed, his feet shuffled. Yet as they returned to the cloister walk, Brother Istvan murmured, "Your pitch improved today." A rare compliment, almost a miracle. But it didn't make Martin smile, because in this place, praise was just another weight to carry. The midday bell echoed through the cloister like a tired breath held too long. After hours of chanting that had drained the marrow from their bones, the monks shuffled out into the icy corridor once again. Not speaking, not sighing, just moving with the momentum of men who no longer questioned why. Their lips still quivered with remnants of Latin. Their eyes, those who dared to lift them, glazed over like fobbed glass. Brother Martin was among them, throat scorched, legs rubbery, and the inside of his mouth as dry as the parchment he'd spent yesterday smudging with ink and remorse. There was no reward waiting for them beyond the chapel, no warm meal, no moment of rest, just a brief reprieve in the form of contemplative silence. As if silence had ever left. A monk's entire existence was a loop of enforced stillness broken only by ritual sound. But this period, between terce and the next meal, was technically personal reflection time, which meant you were allowed to be alone. Just not too alone, lest the devil take interest in your thoughts. Brother Martin made his way to the cloister garden, or what passed for one in winter. A patch of brittle grass, a dying tree, a frozen pond reflecting the low Hungarian sky. This was where the monks were meant to reflect on God's beauty in creation. But in January, God seemed a little less generous. The air smelled like old wood smoke and dried herbs. A crow pecked at a pile of frozen compost. It was all very spiritual. He sat on a low stone bench, careful not to show any outward sign of comfort. Resting too heavily might imply laziness. Slouching could signal pride. Even solitude was suspicious if your face looked too pleased with itself. Brother Istvan passed him once, eyes narrowed, as if trying to detect whether Martin's silence was pure or indulgent. It was that kind of place. The chants still echoed in Martin's head. They always did. Even in sleep. Especially in sleep. Sometimes the psalms crept into his dreams, repeating verses like haunted lullabies. Miserere me, Deus, have mercy on me, O God, sung so many times it no longer felt like a plea, just a sound his throat made out of habit. Mercy was not something anyone here expected. It was something they begged for without expecting a reply. In the afternoon session, known as None the 9th hour, they would chant again. Fewer psalms this time, but still enough to remind them that their voices did not belong to them. Their voices were rented to ritual. And if their bodies couldn't keep up, the punishment was quiet and thorough. A shorter supper. An extra prayer. Public silence when everyone knew what had happened. And always, always, the threat of exclusion from the choir stalls. A humiliation worse than whipping. Monks who couldn't chant were labelled weak in voice. Not a formal condemnation, but an informal stain. Like a bad smell or a habit of blinking too much. Some were reassigned to manual labour. Others, if they were valuable in other ways. Good scribes, strong gardeners, were kept in the margins of the choir, mumbling just low enough not to be noticed. But everyone noticed. And those who chanted too well? That was a different problem. Brother Gellert once sang with what could only be described as a flicker of melody, a sweetness in the tone that was unsettling. It wasn't on purpose. He had once been a shepherd's boy, raised on Hungarian folk songs, and sometimes the rhythm leaked into his liturgical delivery. It made the psalms sound like lullabies, Brother Istvan noticed. Gellert was reassigned to bell-ringing duties for 3 months. The official reason, tempting the choir into aesthetic distraction. Yes, aesthetic distraction. God, it seemed, preferred flatness over feeling. At None they lined up again, robes dragging on stone, cold biting through the sandals that never really protected their feet. The chapel was darker now, the sun casting long skeletal shadows across the stone floor. The candles had burned low, replaced with new ones made of animal fat, their flames sputtering with the occasional pop. The cantor struck the first note. The chant began. Today's psalms were selections from the penitential batch, always a treat. Psalm 51 again, Psalm 130, Psalm 143, verses that spoke of guilt, sin, begging for forgiveness. Some monks recited them with real conviction. Others, with the flatness of men who had memorized the words but long ago lost the meaning. Brother Martin mouthed the verses with aching familiarity. His voice had cracked earlier that day, and he feared it would again. But you didn't stop. Even if your throat bled, you chanted. The air was thick with incense, lit not for beauty, but for discipline. The scent, resinous, earthy, was meant to keep the mind alert. It worked. Too well. The smoke curled around the choir stalls like a serpent, stinging eyes and drying mouths. You couldn't cough. Coughing was a disruption. If you had to, you did it into your robe, silent and desperate, hoping the others didn't hear. If they did, you'd feel it in the silence afterward. Hours passed. Verses bled into one another. And always, the faces of the monks remained unchanged, not blank, but trained into neutrality. Joy was suspicious. Sadness was indulgent. Passion was dangerous. You were supposed to feel devotion, yes, but not show it. Emotion was a crack in the wall where pride could enter. And pride was the cardinal sin in a place that was built on burying the self. The final chant of the session came, De profundis. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. A fitting end, considering most monks felt like they were buried alive in spiritual obligation. The last note held longer than it needed to, not out of drama, but because no one wanted to be the first to drop it. Then, silence, the kind that hums in your bones. They bowed, filed out, and once again became shadows in the cloister halls. That evening, before Compline, Brother Martin found himself washing his hands in the basin near the scriptorium. The water was freezing, his throat burned, his mind was fogged, but still he moved. Still he obeyed. The chants would come again tomorrow. The same words, the same pain, the same weight in his chest that he called piety, but suspected might just be fatigue with a halo. In that moment, he didn't feel holy, he felt hoarse. Chapter 5, The Rule of St. Benedict. When obedience becomes oppression, there's a copy of the Rule of St. Benedict tucked into a wooden chest in the monastery library, bound in oxhide, stained with the sweat of uncounted hands, and marked by the fingerprints of guilt. It's not large, barely the size of a loaf of bread, but within it lies a system so thorough, so immovable, that it managed to shape the daily lives of men for over a millennium. And in this Hungarian monastery, perched between frost and faith, that little book might as well be a god in its own right. The rule doesn't scream. It doesn't command with fire and thunder. It whispers. It whispers so calmly, so reasonably, that you almost don't notice the walls closing in until they've already crushed your sense of self. Brother Martin didn't need to read the rule anymore. It was in his blood, etched into his bones like a second skeleton made of obedience. It began the moment he had entered the monastery's gates. The rule dictated when he woke, how he spoke, when he worked, what he ate, how long he could sleep, how he should think, what thoughts he must confess, what desires he must silence. Everything was regulated. Everything mattered. There were no unimportant moments, no casual gestures. Even the way you walked, deliberate, silent, humble, was subject to scrutiny. You could be punished for walking too quickly, or too slowly, or too confidently, or too slouched. Obedience, as defined by the rule, was total. It wasn't just doing what you were told. It was wanting to do what you were told, joyfully, immediately, without question. The rule used words like gladness, zeal, and cheerfulness, but not in ways that implied happiness. No, this gladness was the gladness of a man who willingly erased himself for the glory of structure. A cheerfulness born not from fulfillment, but from resignation. Brother Martin remembered the first time he hesitated. It was his third week as a novice. He had been told to tend the root cellar simple work, made harder by the rats and the biting cold. He paused for a breath outside the stairwell, just one breath, just a moment. But Brother Istvan had seen. Later that evening, Martin's bread was withheld. No word, no lecture. Just the unmistakable message, obedience delayed is disobedience delivered. There was a part of the rule that addressed this directly. The first degree of humility is prompt obedience. Prompt. Not considered. Not discussed. Just executed. The abbot's voice was the voice of God, and questioning it, even in your heart, was treated as a moral failure. In some monasteries, even facial expressions were policed. A furrowed brow during instruction could land you in silence for days, not as peace, but as punishment. The abbot in this Hungarian monastery, Father Miklos, was not cruel. That was the trick. He didn't yell, he didn't strike, he didn't rage, he simply enforced, gently, completely. His punishments were perfectly aligned with the rule, proportional, emotionless, righteous. A missed prayer hour, 2 days of fasting. A forgotten passage, 3 nights without fire. A tone that bordered on sarcasm, reassignment to dung removal. The rule made it all neat and clean, like spiritual accounting. But here's the part the rule didn't say out loud. When you strip a man of his autonomy, his desire to obey becomes a mask for fear. Obedience becomes armor. You wear it to survive. You say the words not because you believe them, but because not saying them is worse. Over time, it gets harder to tell the difference between genuine piety and practiced submission. Brother Martin knew this. He saw it every day in the eyes of the other monks, especially the older ones, those who had long since stopped wrestling with doubt. Doubt, after all, requires a sense of self, and that is the first thing the rule asks you to kill. The rule also had much to say about speech, namely, don't. Monks should speak rarely and with restraint, it said, as though words were a temptation. And perhaps they were. Words led to thoughts, thoughts to questions, questions to rebellion. Silence was not just holy, it was tactical. Brother Martin hadn't spoken more than 50 words in the past 3 days. Most of them were muttered responses during confession or whispered Latin in choir. His voice was changing, thinner, raspy. He sometimes wondered if it would disappear altogether. Would that be a blessing? Would it make him a better monk? But perhaps the most suffocating part of the rule was its obsession with surveillance. Not with eyes, but with conscience. The rule trained you to be your own jailer, to self-correct, to confess not just actions, but thoughts. There were entire sections devoted to the rituals of penance, the correct way to bow before the abbot, the right words to say when admitting failure. Even the posture of contrition was codified. This wasn't morality, this was performance. Martin remembered the novice brother Danis, a wiry boy with ink-stained fingers and a nervous laugh. He had confessed once to feeling pride after being complimented on his handwriting. Not arrogance, just a flicker of satisfaction. He admitted it during weekly confession. The abbot nodded gently and reassigned him to sweeping the crypt. Until humility is restored, he'd said. 3 months later, Dane still avoided eye contact and rarely smiled. The pride was gone, but so was the light in his eyes. The rule had done its job, and yet, in its pages, the rule of St. Benedict also promised peace. Community. A path to salvation. It spoke of harmony, of shared labour, of prayer as liberation. There was beauty in the idea. The monastery was supposed to be a haven from the chaos of the world, a family, a sanctuary, and maybe, for a few, it was. But for most, it felt more like a life sentence wrapped in hymns. What made it worse was how reasonable it all sounded. The rule wasn't tyrannical, it was measured, balanced. It quoted scripture, it appealed to logic. It used phrases like, for the good of the soul, and for the building of the community. It offered just enough purpose to dull your resistance. And so you obeyed. Because if you didn't, the rule didn't punish you. You did. The thing about obedience, Martin had come to realize, was that it never really ended. It wasn't like completing a chore or saying your prayers and wiping your hands clean. Obedience in the monastery was like fog. It settled into your clothes, your skin, your thoughts. And by the time you noticed it was there, it was already too thick to escape. The rule didn't simply govern what you did. It made you second-guess what you were. And it was always watching, even when no one else was. That was the brilliance of it. There were no guards in the monastery, no bars on the windows, no chains or locks. And yet, the system held fast, tighter than iron. The rule didn't need muscle. It used guilt. You'd feel it in the quiet moments. The itch in your soul when you lingered too long over a spoonful of soup. The shadow in your mind when your thoughts strayed toward warmth or softness, or the life you left behind. Guilt did the job of a dozen guards. And best of all, it was free. It wasn't that Martin didn't believe. He did, or at least he had. Somewhere, deep down, he still wanted to be close to God. That was why he came here. That's why most of them came. But over time, the rituals replaced the reasons. He no longer knew if he prayed because he meant it or simply because the bell had rung. Faith had become a muscle memory. He bowed when he was supposed to, spoke when it was permitted, and confessed at regular intervals. It all felt hollow. But to question the system was to question God. And that was unthinkable. The rule had chapters on everything. How the monks should sleep. How many psalms should be sung. How to receive guests. What to do when a monk is late for prayer. It was comprehensive to the point of absurdity. If a novice sneezed too loudly, the rule had an opinion on it. If you scratched your scalp during a lecture, there was probably a clause on personal stillness and the temptation of vanity. The micro-regulation wasn't a flaw, it was the feature. And the monks? They enforced it better than any bishop ever could, because the rule didn't live in books, it lived in them. Brother Istvan once scolded a younger monk, not for breaking the rules, but for breaking the spirit of the rule. That was the terrifying part. The rule had no clear borders. It seeped into tone, gesture, even facial expression. It wasn't just what you did, it was how you felt when you did it. There were levels to the obedience too. The outer ring was easy enough, wake at the right hour, say the right words, kneel when told. But deeper inside, the rule demanded more. Inner stillness, true humility, the complete annihilation of the ego. You weren't just expected to obey, you were expected to love obeying. Not because someone was watching, but because God was. And God didn't miss a thing. The worst part was that the rule worked. It created order, predictability. In a medieval world racked by famine, war, disease and chaos, the monastery was a sanctuary of discipline. There were no random floggings, no screaming landlords, no soldiers kicking in doors. Here you knew what would happen every hour, every day, every week. It was safe. But safety came at a price, the surrender of self. Brother Martin often looked at the older monks and wondered what they'd been like before the rule consumed them. Had they laughed once? Had they danced in the snow, kissed a girl, sung a tavern song? Most never spoke of their lives before entering. The past was seen as a temptation, a reminder of the flesh, the world, the self. They had shaved their heads not just to show humility, but to sever ties with the person they used to be. It was said that the rule freed men from temptation. And perhaps it did, but it also freed them from spontaneity, from curiosity, from joy. Everything was flattened. A monk was not meant to shine, he was meant to vanish into the rhythm of the cloister. One evening Martin had stumbled upon Brother Thomas alone in the chapel, long after Compline. The old monk sat with his back to the altar, staring at the flickering candlelight. His eyes looked distant, haunted. Martin had been about to leave when Thomas spoke, soft, raspy, deliberate. "Do you know," he said, "there was a time when I thought this rule would make me holy. And now, I think it just made me quiet." They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. Martin understood. He felt it in his bones. The kind of silence that went deeper than the absence of sound, the kind that hollowed out the corners of your soul. And still, the rule went on. It was read every week in the refectory, one chapter at a time, over meals. Between spoonfuls of broth and bites of stale bread, the lector would recite its commandments. The monks would nod, bow, swallow, agree. The words would drift down their throats along with the barley gruel, settling in their stomachs like wet stones. There was no debating the rule, no amendments, no evolution. It was perfect. Or so they said. Brother Martin wasn't so sure anymore. He didn't say this aloud, of course, not even in confession. Some sins were best left unnamed. He began to notice little cracks. Not in the monastery. God knew the abbot kept that place tighter than a miser's purse. But in the men. A glance that lingered too long. A prayer that faltered. A sigh that escaped during chanting. Nothing major, just hairline fractures. But once you saw them, you couldn't unsee them. The rule had taught them obedience, but it had also taught them fear. The fear of doing wrong, of thinking wrong, of being wrong. And fear, no matter how sacred its packaging, was a terrible teacher. Chapter 6. Brother, you stink. Hygiene in the monastery. There are few things in this world more ironic than a group of men dedicating their lives to spiritual purity while quietly fermenting under wool robes. The monastery, that hallowed house of discipline, divine order, and moral vigilance, somehow managed to overlook a rather basic truth. Cleanliness may be next to godliness, but apparently only when it's convenient. And in a 13th century Hungarian monastery, it rarely was. Brother Martin first realized the scope of this problem not through reading, but through his nose. It was his 4th week inside the cloister walls, and he'd been assigned to the candle-pouring station in the cellar, where fat and wax were melted together in a rank pot the size of a wine barrel. That smell, one might expect. But what caught him off guard was the stench that hovered in the robes around him. It was not a smell that could be described easily. Somewhere between wet goat, old books, and guilt. You see, monks weren't exactly forbidden from bathing, but bathing too often? Now that was suspicious. The rule of St. Benedict never outright bans cleanliness, but it also doesn't encourage it with any real urgency. Bathing was usually prescribed only when necessary, say before a major feast day, or if a monk had become visibly crusty. The logic was simple. To care too much for the flesh was to risk vanity. And vanity led to pride. And pride, as everyone here knew, was the slippery slope to damnation. So, most monks bathed 2 or 3 times a year. 4, if they were unusually sinful or had an unfortunate run-in with the latrine cleaning schedule. Brother Martin, like many novices, learned quickly that smelling slightly less awful than the man next to you was considered a dangerous form of ambition. Their robes didn't help. Made of coarse wool, dyed brown or black depending on the order, the garments trapped moisture like a confession traps shame. They were rarely washed, not out of laziness, but because they were seen as part of the monastic identity. If a robe became too dirty, it might be brushed or beaten, but not soaked. Water was precious. Soap was rarer. And besides, the monks were supposed to detach from bodily discomfort, which was a lovely idea, until the summer months rolled in and half the choir began smelling like spoiled broth. Footwear was another issue. Most monks wore sandals, open-toed, made of leather or rope. In winter, these became torture devices. In rain, they became sponges. And in general, they served more as ceremonial gestures toward footwear than anything resembling protection. Calluses formed quickly. Sores weren't uncommon. Infections, well, those were dealt with by prayer and herb poultices. A limp wasn't a sign of illness. It was seen as an opportunity for extra humility. And then there were the lice. Lice were not considered a pest. They were considered a test, a holy trial. Monks who suffered from lice were often praised for their patience. In fact, Brother Thomas once told Martin with a straight face that St. Macarius of Egypt had referred to his lice as pearl-like gifts from the Lord. Martin wasn't sure what was more disturbing, the statement or the fact that Thomas seemed genuinely envious of the saint's dedication. The monastery did have combs, wooden, wide-toothed things that scraped more than they groomed. Monks were encouraged to comb their hair weekly, if they had hair. Many were tonsured, the crowns of their heads shaved as a sign of submission. But even that required maintenance. Hair still grew, and when it did, it collected sweat and dust like a sponge collects mould. Nails, trimmed with knives. Teeth, scrubbed with cloth if you were lucky. Most didn't bother. Toothaches were treated with clove or sage pressed against the gum, followed by prayer. Tooth loss was simply expected. By the age of 35, most monks had mouths like empty tombs. Latrines were communal. A narrow stone room with holes cut into a wooden plank, often suspended over a shallow trench. There was no privacy, no stalls, no shame. You sat, you stared at the wall, and you pretended that Brother Gilere across from you wasn't humming a psalm while relieving himself. And yes, that was a common occurrence. Sometimes chanting was encouraged in the latrine, the logic being that idleness invited temptation. You were to empty your bowels and cleanse your soul simultaneously. Washing hands was expected, especially before meals. But again, water was rationed. A single basin at the entrance to the refectory served the entire cloister. The water was changed infrequently. You dipped, not scrubbed. The goal wasn't cleanliness, it was ritual purity. Whether or not your fingers were actually clean after the wash was secondary to whether they had been washed. Monks with actual medical issues, boils, rashes, infections, were sent to the infirmary, which consisted of a cot, a crucifix, and a wooden bowl of garlic-infused wine. The infirmarian monk might apply a salve made from herbs grown in the monastery's garden, sage for swelling, chamomile for skin, yarrow for bleeding. The treatments were more symbolic than effective. If you recovered, it was a miracle. If not, it was a trial. Either way, the rule approved. And yet, through all this, the monastery maintained a certain reputation for holiness. Outsiders assumed the monks were paragons of virtue, their bodily filth merely the mark of saintly detachment. Pilgrims visited with reverence, nobles donated land, peasants knelt at the gate. No one questioned the stink. If anything, it added to the myth. Because here, in these stone walls, the body was never the point. It was a burden, a sack of sin dragging the soul down. The less attention you gave it, the more likely your spirit would rise. So they ignored the sores, the smells, the parasites, they embraced the rot, and called it righteousness. But for Martin, some days were harder than others. He could endure the hunger, the chanting, the silence, but the smell, the ever-present cloud of sour wool, damp feet, unwashed mouths, was something else. It followed him into sleep. It haunted him during prayer. It made God feel distant. Because sometimes, when your breath smells like mildew and your robes haven't been cleaned since Pentecost, it's difficult to believe you were made in the image of anything divine. The monastery had its own distinct ecosystem. A closed loop of faith, filth and function where the air hung perpetually thick with the smell of old wax, dried sweat, candle soot, and the slow fermentation of wool robes worn beyond their natural expiration. By noon, the cloister was a greenhouse of scent. Not the fragrant kind of blooming lavender or sweet basil from the herb garden. Those were reserved for salves in the sick room, but the earthy aroma of men marinated in ritual and routine. No one commented on it, of course. That would have been unseemly. To acknowledge the smell was to acknowledge the body. And that was a line you didn't cross unless you had a death wish, or worse, a sense of humour. Brother Martin tried, as all monks were trained to do, to ignore it. You developed a mental filter over time, like tuning out the persistent ring of church bells. But there were moments, specific, cruelly timed moments, when that filter cracked, like when you stood too close to someone during Mass and caught a gust of weak old turnip breath, or when Brother Lazare passed by and his robes exhaled the unmistakable aroma of mildew and despair. The reality was simple. Monastic hygiene was a patchwork system of outdated Roman knowledge, half-remembered folk remedies, and outright neglect dressed up as humility. The Romans, to their credit, had public baths, running water, even soap made of animal fat and ashes. But by the 13th century in rural Hungary, such luxuries were not just forgotten, they were regarded with suspicion. To cleanse the body too often was to open the door to vanity. And vanity, as we know, was the devil's perfume. Still, some monks tried. Quietly. Secretly. They would sneak to the rain barrel during storms, splashing cold water on their arms and under their tunic, scrubbing with moss or sand. Others would slip into the herb shed, under the guise of fetching sage, and rub their necks with crushed mint or thyme, hoping to mask their stench without appearing too eager. But these small rebellions carried risks. A monk who smelled too fresh might raise eyebrows. Freshness implied effort. Effort implied self-interest. And self-interest was the gateway drug to pride. Brother Martin had once shared a cell with a novice named Jacob, who shaved the soles of his feet with a sharpened flake of pottery. Not out of hygiene, but out of desperation. The itch from the fungal growth between his toes had become unbearable. He'd tried to hide the wound, but the infirmarian noticed the limp. Jacob was questioned, then reassigned to the manure pit for reflection on bodily detachment. He limped through his punishment and left the monastery within a year. He simply disappeared one morning. The abbot never spoke of him again. And so the monks learned not to treat their bodies, but to tolerate them. A sore throat, gargle salt, and recite the Beatitudes. An infected cut, smear garlic and invoke St. Sebastian. An eye swelling with pus, cover it with a rag and ask for extra psalms. These weren't cures. They were rituals, and rituals were what mattered. The communal spaces didn't help. The dormitory, with its rows of wooden planks masquerading as beds, was a soup of smells at night. There were no sheets, no blankets beyond coarse wool, no privacy either. If you turned in your sleep, someone heard. If you snored, someone judged. If you emitted anything unholy from the lower half of your body, well, that was chalked up to sin escaping the flesh. The wash basins, meanwhile, were carved stone troughs with stale water and the occasional floating leaf or insect corpse. There was no soap. Soap was expensive, imported, rare. The monastery might have had a single bar kept under lock, used by the abbot and possibly older than Christ. Most monks used sand or nothing at all. The idea was to scrape, not cleanse, and the basins were not regularly changed. You washed your hands in the same water. 50 other hands had muddied before you, a cleansing ritual in the loosest possible sense. Lice and fleas thrived. They lived in the folds of robes, in the seams of sandals, in the shaved crowns of heads. You could feel them, crawling, biting. But you didn't swat or complain. That, again, was vanity. Saints were said to have welcomed vermin as a form of divine companionship. St. Bernard was rumoured to have once named his fleas. In the monastery, suffering was currency. The more you itched, the richer your soul became. Yet not all were equally pious or equally tolerant. The abbot's chamber was suspiciously better aired. His bedding was changed quarterly. He had access to warm water, even rose oil on feast days. No one said anything, of course. Hierarchy existed even here, cloaked in the language of merit. The abbot's comfort wasn't indulgence. It was reward. His cleanliness, we were told, was symbolic proof that the soul could, with enough devotion, elevate the flesh. But most monks didn't elevate. They decayed slowly. Their bodies crumbled under the weight of prayer, fasting, and neglect. Rotten teeth, twisted nails, open sores. These were the badges of monastic life. They wore them with stoic resolve. And when a monk died, as they often did in their 30s or 40s, his body was washed, not with water, but with wine, blessed salt, and regret. Brother Martin used to dream of cleanliness, not in grand ways, just simple things. A linen shirt washed in river water, fingers scrubbed with soap until the dirt under his nails gave up and fled, hair trimmed evenly, feet without calluses. These were not holy dreams, but they were persistent. In his most exhausted moments, he wondered if heaven would smell clean, or if, after death, he would carry this scent with him like a second skin. He tried not to think that way. Doubt was contagious. If you indulged it, it grew roots. So he dipped his hands in the icy basin, rubbed the dirt into his palms like a penance, and dried them on the hem of his robe, which had not seen soap since the last papal election. He returned to his work, to the silence, to the prayers, to the cloister that stank of sacrifice and sanctity in equal measure. And when the evening bell rang, echoing over the hills, the scent of holiness still clung to them. Or maybe it was just the smell of men too faithful or too frightened to bathe. Chapter 7, Secrets Beneath the Cloister, Forbidden Temptations. There's something you start to notice after years behind monastery walls, something that isn't written in the Rule of St. Benedict, or taught during novice instruction, or chanted about in the endless psalms echoing off the chapel stone. It begins as a flicker in someone's glance, a too long pause in conversation, a brief touch that lingers a heartbeat beyond what's holy. And eventually, it becomes unavoidable beneath the pristine hum of prayer, under the weight of ritual and rot. There is an undercurrent of want, not just for food or comfort, but for everything else that men are supposed to leave behind when they enter the cloister. Desire doesn't die when you take a vow. It waits. Brother Martin didn't learn this through books or sermons or the soft murmurs of moral instruction. He learned it the way most monks do, by watching. There were things the brothers never said aloud, and yet everyone knew. Forbidden temptations weren't chased here. They were suppressed, buried, prayed away, fasted over. But suppression has a half-life, and when men live in silence long enough, the noise inside them finds its own way out. The cloister was designed to kill the self. You surrendered your name, your family, your past. You dressed like the others, ate like the others, prayed in lockstep with the others. The idea was spiritual unity. But real life didn't always cooperate. Monks were men before they were anything else, and men carry shadows. Lust, envy, anger, regret. These weren't exorcised by scripture, they were only quieted, temporarily. It was common knowledge, though never spoken, that some monks had arrangements, not open ones, nothing overt, just a shared glance across the refectory. A hushed prayer said, kneeling slightly too close in the chapel. Late-night encounters cloaked as meditative walks. These were not rampant sins, they were moments of weakness, whispered into dark corners like confessions with no priest to hear them. And it wasn't just carnal longing. That would have been easy to condemn. The temptations here were subtler, more insidious. The desire to be seen, to be admired, to be special. Some monks competed, not for riches obviously, but for spiritual superiority. Who chanted more loudly, who fasted longer, who bore their suffering with the most elegant despair. Pride wore a monk's robe better than any sinner ever could. Brother Istvan, for instance, was obsessed with discipline. He corrected others relentlessly, not cruelly, but with the smug serenity of a man who believed his virtue was its own reward. His quill strokes were perfect, his Latin flawless, his robe folded with military precision. But behind his eyes, Martin sometimes caught a flicker of something darker, not lust, not anger, just a desperate need to be recognized as holy. It was ambition in religious camouflage, and it was everywhere. There were monks who hoarded, not gold or jewels, but minor privileges, a slightly thicker blanket, a softer candle, extra time in the garden. They would trade favors, silent, subtle barters. Brother Geller once offered to take an older monk's night watch in exchange for an extra portion of stew. He claimed it was charity, but everyone knew it was greed, wrapped in generosity. The lines blurred here. Books were another temptation. Not all manuscripts were scripture. The monastery held a few rare texts, herbals with drawings of the human body, Roman histories, even the occasional philosophical tract that hinted at a world beyond prayer. Access to these was controlled, limited to trusted scribes or senior monks. But copies floated in secret, pages tucked under robes, paragraphs committed to memory. A monk who could quote Seneca too easily was either brilliant or dangerously curious. And yet, the biggest temptation wasn't sex or food or books. It was escape. Not physically, though there were stories of monks who fled into the forest, never to return. But mentally, emotionally, spiritually, the quiet breaking, the silent rebellion. You did your tasks, said your prayers, wore your habit, but inside, a part of you had stopped believing. That was the true heresy, not leaving the monastery, but staying while hollow. Brother Martin knew the feeling. It crept in slowly, not as a dramatic crisis, but as a numbness. The words of the Psalms began to sound like noise. The smell of incense no longer stirred reverence, just nausea. He found himself praying with his lips while his mind wandered to the hills beyond the gate. What did grass feel like under bare feet? What did it sound like to hear a woman laugh without shame? Was the outside world truly so fallen, or had he simply grown allergic to this forced piety? He wasn't alone. During garden work one day, Brother Tamas, aged and always alert, murmured without looking up, "I once dreamed of building a boat. Didn't even know how to swim." He smiled faintly. Just wanted to drift. Anywhere. Then he went back to trimming the lavender like he hadn't just admitted to treason. The monastery wasn't built for dreamers. It was built for destroyers, men willing to destroy their past, their personality, their passions. What remained was supposed to be a vessel for God, but often what remained was just a shell. Temptation, in that sense, was a mirror. It didn't show you evil, it showed you who you used to be and who you might have been, a man who could have married, laughed, written poems, broken rules not because he was wicked, but because he was human. The cloister tried to erase that man. But traces survived, in dreams, in accidental smiles, in the way your hand hesitated before copying a line you no longer believed. The bell tolled for vespers, another round of chants, another chance to drown temptation in ritual. Martin stood, wiped his dirt-streaked hands on his robe, and walked toward the chapel. He passed Brother Adorjan on the path, who was frowning at a cracked tile like it had personally offended God. As Martin entered the chapel, the air was already heavy with incense. Candles flickered. Shadows danced on stone. He took his place in the choir stall, eyes closed, lips poised. Deus in adiutorium meum intende, and somewhere deep inside, temptation waited. Not shouting, just breathing. Temptation in a monastery was not a sudden thunderstorm. It was fog thick, creeping, and always present. You rarely noticed when it arrived. You only realized it had never left. The walls of the cloister didn't block it. They trapped it, sealed it in with the men who were supposed to have left such worldly poisons behind. And so it festered, quietly, invisibly, sanctified by routine, hidden under layers of ritual and robes. Brother Martin understood now that the monastery was not a fortress against temptation, but a theatre for it, a place where men performed piety so thoroughly that the audience, God included, might never guess what was happening behind the curtain. But even performances require actors, and actors, no matter how seasoned, slip up eventually. One afternoon, while cleaning out the herb shed, Martin discovered a folded scrap of parchment tucked behind a jar of dried sage. It wasn't scripture. It wasn't even in Latin. It was a poem written in Hungarian, short, clumsy, and painfully earnest. It spoke of spring, of soft skin, of longing. Not lustful exactly, but deeply human. It ended with the line, "Even my silence sings your name." No signature. No handwriting Martin recognized. But it wasn't the words that unsettled him. It was the fact that they existed at all, proof that someone, somewhere in this place, had dared to remember they had a heart. He folded it again, slower this time, and left it where he found it. There were other signs too. In the scriptorium, certain monks lingered at particular desks, not by assignment, but by proximity. Pages were exchanged without cause. Small nods during compline. Shared smiles, quickly hidden. Once, Martin saw Brother Gellert brush past another monk in the cloister walk, fingers grazing for just a breath. It could have been accidental. It probably wasn't. These were not scandalous affairs. Nothing theatrical. No nighttime trysts or whispered confessions behind closed doors. The monastery was far too disciplined for that. What happened instead was subtler. Emotion held in eye contact. A soft word passed during morning work. Companionship, where there should have been nothing but brotherhood and detachment. Even friendship, when acknowledged too warmly, carried the taint of forbidden closeness. The rule warned against particular friendships. It discouraged monks from becoming too attached to one another. Love, it insisted, must be given equally, with no favourites, because favourites bred affection, and affection bred intimacy, and intimacy, God forbid, bred the kind of closeness that made celibacy seem less noble and more tragic. So monks learned to distribute their attention like alms, evenly, impersonally, and without expectation. But of course, humans are humans. Even behind stone walls and centuries of doctrine, the real question wasn't whether monks experienced temptation, it was how they survived it. Some channeled it into discipline, extra fasting, sleepless nights, scrubbing stone floors until their knuckles bled. Others buried it deeper. They stopped looking people in the eye. They answered every conversation with scripture. They trained their minds to see sin in every shadow. And then there were those who broke quietly, invisibly. You wouldn't notice unless you were watching closely. The missed chant, the untrimmed fingernails, the haunted silence at meals. Brother Martin was still young, but already he could feel temptation shifting inside him, not just as desire, but as disillusionment. He didn't crave a lover or a secret, he craved honesty. The honesty to admit that monks were not angels. That sanctity didn't always feel sacred. That there were mornings when he woke and felt nothing at all. Not joy, not devotion, not even doubt. Just emptiness. And in that emptiness, temptation whispered, not to sin, but to stop pretending. Late one night, as frost creaked across the windows and the wind groaned against the dormitory shutters, Martin lay awake on his wooden plank, staring at the ceiling. The dormitory was dark, save for the moonlight that spilled in narrow bars across the floor. He could hear breathing all around him, the slow rhythm of sleeping bodies wrapped in identical robes, facing identical lives. He turned his head and saw Brother Tammuz, awake, eyes open, looking at nothing. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. In the morning, nothing would change. They would rise at the bell, dress in silence, file into the chapel, chant the same verses they'd chanted 1,000 times. But under that routine, something had cracked. An invisible thread snapped not by lust or rebellion, but by the weight of years spent pretending there was no thread at all. The danger wasn't in giving in. It was in losing the part of yourself that could still feel tempted. There were rumours, of course, about how the monastery handled transgressions that couldn't be ignored. A monk caught in a carnal act might be sent to another abbey in disgrace. If the sin was public, he might be excommunicated. If he was lucky, reassigned to perpetual silence. If unlucky, well, monasteries had basements, cells, crypts not always reserved for the dead. But those were rare stories. Most monks broke slowly, in ways that didn't make noise. Their faith withered, their eyes dulled, their chants grew mechanical, their smiles became rare. And yet they stayed, because leaving meant failure, and staying meant penance. Temptation was not always a fall. Sometimes it was just a mirror. And sometimes that mirror was too accurate to look away from. Chapter 8. The Abbot's Iron Grip. Discipline and Dungeons. In theory, the abbot was a spiritual father, firm, wise, and endlessly patient. He was to rule not by fear but by example, a beacon of virtue whose authority came from divine order, not domination. That's what the rule of St. Benedict claimed anyway. In practice, the abbot was often more warden than father, especially in monasteries far from oversight, nestled deep in the Hungarian wilderness where discipline was enforced not by theology, but by proximity and power. Father Miklos had not been born an abbot. He had once been a novice, like Martin, like all of them, an unpolished soul eager to impress. Somewhere between his vow of obedience and his rise to power, something had calcified. He was not cruel, not overtly. His punishments were always quiet. His corrections were mild in tone, but absolute in outcome. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. Fear did his speaking for him. Brother Martin had long learned the difference between devotion and control. One inspired, the other maintained silence. Father Miklos maintained a monastery where even the birds outside the chapel seemed to chirp with caution. The man never walked. He glided. His black robes, a degree darker than everyone else's, marked him out like a shadow stitched into daylight. His eyes were sunken yet sharp, always watching, yet never revealing what they saw. It was said that he remembered every name, every penance, every infraction, no matter how small, that once he had punished a monk for whispering too gently. "You must not only speak the truth," he had said, "but speak it firmly enough to pierce temptation." That monk had been reassigned to cleaning the privy for 3 months. No official reprimand, no scarlet letter, just a silent redirection wrapped in grace. There was a punishment cell beneath the west wing. No one spoke of it directly, but every monk knew it was there. Not a dungeon in the theatrical sense. No iron bars or torches or chains, but something worse. A narrow, windowless room lined with stone so thick it muffled even the sound of prayer. It had no bed, no candle, just a cold floor and a crucifix carved into the wall. Solitary confinement for the soul. The monks called it the mouth of silence. No one entered the mouth of silence unless the abbot ordered it, and the abbot only ordered it when all other forms of discipline had failed, or when a lesson had to be made unforgettable. Brother Lazar had been sent there once, a tall man, rough around the edges, known for grumbling during fasting days. One winter, after murmuring something unflattering about the rule within earshot of Father Miklos, he vanished for 5 days. When he returned, he said nothing. He worked more slowly. He chanted less enthusiastically, and he avoided eye contact like it might burn him. The abbot never mentioned it, no sermon, no public shaming. Just that same calm gaze, and the message it always carried, I know. It wasn't just the cell that kept monks in line, it was the surveillance. Every task was observed, every prayer heard. The abbot's lieutenants, senior monks loyal to his way, circulated constantly. They were not inquisitors. They smiled, helped carry wood, complimented your script. But they always remembered who stepped out of line and when. Confession, too, became a tool. What began as a ritual of purification turned into intelligence gathering. The abbot heard everything. He listened with the tenderness of a father and the memory of a ledger. A monk who confessed to wandering thoughts during prayer might find himself reassigned to more physical labour the next day to help ground the mind. Those who confessed too little were watched more closely. Silence, after all, could be a sin of omission. But the most effective tool in the abbot's arsenal wasn't fear of punishment, it was guilt. He knew exactly how to wield it. His rebukes were never cruel, they were kind, devastatingly kind. A soft sigh, a disappointed look, a gentle question, "Is your heart truly with us, brother?" No shouting, just the unbearable weight of someone believing you had failed him, and God, in a single breath. Many monks would have preferred lashes. Even praise could be dangerous. To be noticed was to be marked. The abbot rarely complimented anyone, but when he did, it came with expectations. When Brother Istvan was elevated to librarian, it was seen as an honour. But the scrutiny that followed broke him down slowly. A mistake in manuscript handling led to a week without speech. A second slip meant 3 days fasting. By the end of the month, he looked hollow-eyed and flinched whenever addressed. The title remained. The pride did not. It was said the abbot slept only 3 hours a night, that he rose to pray in the dead of darkness, keeping vigil while others dreamed of sins they dared not name. Whether true or not, the idea worked. It made him more than mortal. It made him mythic. A man so holy he didn't need rest. And myths, after all, are far harder to disobey than men. And yet, through all this, most monks still revered him. That was the genius. He had made himself indispensable. To question him was to question the very stability of the cloister, the silence, the rhythm, the sense that someone was watching the moral perimeter while you fought your internal battles. He was the shepherd, and no matter how heavy the staff, the sheep stayed close. Martin struggled with this reverence. He admired the abbot's discipline, yes, his knowledge, his command of scripture, his ability to maintain order. But admiration wasn't trust. He couldn't forget the mouth of silence. He couldn't unsee the way the younger novices flinched under the abbot's gaze. He couldn't ignore the quiet ache of fear that pulsed beneath every act of obedience. Sometimes, during communal meals, the abbot would walk among them, not eating, just observing. His presence stilled forks, slowed chewing, straightened spines. A casual question, "Is the gruel well cooked today?" could send ripples of panic through the kitchen staff. His smile was warm, but it rarely reached his eyes. And yet, he never had to raise a hand. He never had to shout. He ruled not through tyranny, but through a perfect, suffocating version of order. And that, Martin realised, was the most dangerous kind of control. The kind you don't even notice until the gate is locked. Discipline in the monastery was never loud. It didn't need to be. That was the genius of it. There were no raised voices, no dramatic punishments doled out in the centre of the cloister courtyard. Instead, there was a system so tightly wound, so perfectly calibrated, that its cruelty often wore the mask of spiritual concern. And Father Miklos, the abbot, was its silent conductor, never seen carrying a rod, but always managing to keep every spine straight and every head bowed. Brother Martin watched it happen again and again. A novice forgets to genuflect at the altar. He's not reprimanded, merely reassigned to the cemetery garden for a week where the work is endless and the wind never stops. Another monk yawns during Lauds, not loudly, not even rudely, and he finds his meal portion halved without explanation. No note, no warning, just a thin ladle of broth and an unspoken message. Wake up your soul, or your body will learn instead. It was this silence, this artful avoidance of confrontation, that made the system so unbearable. You could never be quite sure what you'd done wrong, only that you had, somewhere, somehow. The consequences appeared like ghosts, shadows with form but no name. You found yourself excluded from a reading duty, denied access to the scriptorium, or asked to repeat the psalms in private until your spirit is realigned. Guilt was assumed. Proof was optional. And the monks accepted it. They bowed lower, prayed longer, walked more carefully through the halls, because that was safer than questioning the rules, or worse, the man behind them. Father Miklos moved through the cloister like a storm cloud too dignified to thunder. His sermons were elegant, brief, devastating. He quoted scripture not to enlighten, but to convict. When he looked at you while speaking of sin, you felt seen in ways that scraped at your inner walls. You looked down. Always. The abbot didn't deal in sin the way most clergy did. He didn't thunder against it. He lured it out, gently, like coaxing a rat from its hole. He asked questions in confession like he already knew the answers. "Have your thoughts been orderly, Brother Martin?" he asked once, voice soft as candle wax. Martin had stammered out something close to yes, and the abbot only nodded, no reaction. But the next week, Martin was assigned to night watch at the chapel, 4 hours standing in the cold, staring at shadows, with nothing but his thoughts for company. The message had been clear. If your thoughts aren't orderly by now, they soon will be. But the abbot's reach wasn't confined to the living spaces. The architecture itself seemed to reflect his control. Every hallway echoed with steps in perfect symmetry. Every bell rang a minute early, not late. The prayer books, the tools, the candles, each item in its place, like a military camp built for souls instead of soldiers. Even the gardens were trimmed with almost mathematical precision. Nothing grew wild here, not even the weeds. Beneath the chapel, beneath the scriptorium, beneath even the old wine cellars that hadn't seen wine in a generation, was the room everyone pretended didn't exist. The punishment cell. Martin had never seen it, but he had seen what it did. He'd seen Brother Vilmos come back from it with pale cheeks and hands that trembled at the sound of bells. He'd seen Brother Andre return with a stitched gash across his knuckles and eyes that no longer lingered on anything beautiful. The abbot never confirmed the cell existed, but then again he never denied it either. That was the real weapon-plausible piety. He didn't need to strike fear with words. He let the walls do it for him. Punishments in the monastery weren't meant to correct behaviour. They were meant to remind you that your body, your will, your voice, none of them were truly yours. Not anymore. You had given them up when you crossed the gate and took the vow. The fact that the abbot enforced that vow with the precision of an executioner only made him seem more righteous. There was a saying passed quietly among the younger monks, "The Lord forgives." The abbot remembers. It was meant as a joke. It never felt like one. Brother Martin began to notice how the abbot isolated certain brothers, not physically, but relationally. A nod here. A gaze held a little too long there. He chose favourites not to reward them, but to make them targets. Privilege always came with a cost. Those raised too high were often brought down swiftly and publicly, in ways that inspired the rest to keep their heads lower. Once, the abbot had promoted Brother Conrad, a skilled illuminator, to oversee the production of a manuscript gifted to a local bishop. For weeks, Conrad glowed with pride. His letters curled like vines, his pigments shimmered, his fingers worked like inspired tools. But a small mistake, missing punctuation in a line from Matthew, triggered the fall. The abbot did not chastise him. Instead, he made Conrad redo the entire page, then another, then stripped him of his title, assigned him to scullery work. The manuscript was never mentioned again. It wasn't the loss of position that broke Conrad. It was the silence around it, the careful erasure of his efforts, the way no one spoke of his work or his mistake as if neither had happened. That was how the abbot punished most severely, by making you invisible. And yet, despite all this, the monastery never rebelled. There were no whispered plots, no protests. The system functioned precisely because of its predictability. For men who'd abandoned the outside world, its chaos, its injustice, this kind of control felt safer, even when it suffocated. There was comfort in knowing your place, even when that place was beneath someone's thumb. Brother Martin often wondered what it would take to shatter the illusion. A fire, a scandal, a confession too big to hide, but nothing ever happened. The abbot maintained his kingdom of ritual and fear, and the monks bowed lower each year. One night after Compline, Martin stood in the chapel alone. The moonlight painted the pews in grey light. He looked up at the crucifix. It stared back, distant, nailed to its place. And for the first time, he wondered if obedience was holiness, or just fear, carved in stone and dressed in robes. Chapter 9. Penance or Madness. When guilt becomes a cage, there is a kind of silence in a monastery that doesn't feel holy. It isn't the silence of peaceful contemplation or the gentle hush that settles over prayer. No. This silence is sharper, heavier. It clings to the stone like mould and settles behind your ribs like a secret. It is the silence of guilt unspoken, of thoughts that are no longer your own, and of penance that no longer leads anywhere. Brother Martin had come to recognize it early, not by name, but by pressure. It built gradually, like dust in the corners of your mind. Every mistake, every doubt, every selfish impulse, real or imagined, was added to a growing weight you were expected to carry without complaint. You were told this weight was sacred, that it was a gift, that it was how God refined your soul. But sometimes it just broke you. The rule of St. Benedict treated guilt like a tool. Penance was its sharpening stone. If you fell short, missed a verse, spoke without permission, dreamt too vividly, you were expected to confess, not just the act, but the thought. Not just the thought, but the feeling. And the process never ended. You confessed, repented, and then watched your own mind like a prison guard, waiting for the next lapse. Even in sleep, the weight was there. Dreams became suspicious. Rest became penance in disguise. It was spiritual introspection turned into psychological warfare. Brother Martin remembered a sermon where the abbot had declared, "The soul must be purified by fire, and guilt is the flame." Everyone nodded. But Martin had looked around the chapel and seen faces so tight with tension they looked carved from stone. These weren't men refining their souls. They were men trying not to shatter. The problem wasn't just that guilt was everywhere. It was that there was never enough absolution to match it. Confession was supposed to offer relief, but in the monastery it often deepened the wound. You approached the abbot, knelt on cold stone, and whispered sins that might not even be sins. I found myself remembering my sister's voice. I desired a softer robe. I wanted to eat more than I was given. The abbot would nod, "Thank you," and assign your penance. A longer fast. More silence. Scrubbing the floor beneath the altar in solitude. And when you completed the penance, there was no embrace, no lifting of burden, only another day, another chance to fail. Some monks confessed so frequently that it became their entire spiritual identity. They sought out faults like scavengers, digging through their minds to find imperfections to offer up, not out of vanity, but desperation. If you confessed enough, maybe you would finally feel clean. If you punished yourself enough, maybe you'd feel worthy. But guilt is greedy. It never stops asking for more. Brother Andras had once been known for his laughter, rare, quiet, but unmistakable, a warm sound in a place that rarely made room for joy. He had confessed once that he laughed during prayer, not at God, but at the sheer absurdity of a Latin phrase that reminded him of a childhood song. The abbot had reassigned him to the crypt records, where he would spend weeks copying names of the dead in silence. He never laughed again. By the time Martin had arrived, Andras barely spoke. He walked the halls with his head down, mumbled his chants, and avoided eye contact. His hands trembled slightly when he held the psalter. When asked to read aloud, his voice cracked, not from weakness, but from something deeper. As if the guilt had eroded the foundation of his self, grain by grain. There were stories of monks who had gone mad, not in violent, dramatic ways, but quietly. They stopped speaking, refused to eat, repeated the same prayer for hours without realizing it. Some would wake in the night screaming about fire or rot. Others wandered the cloisters barefoot in winter, convinced that the cold was a penance sent from heaven. The monastery didn't exile them, it just moved them into the infirmary, or the unused cell behind the library, a kind of sacred containment. One monk, Brother Lurink, was said to have carved a psalm into the wooden wall of his cell using a broken quill, all 150 verses, in Latin, backward. When asked why, he simply said, "I wanted God to see me differently." And yet, this madness was rarely seen as failure. It was sanctified. He has chosen the path of deepest humility, the abbot would say, or he is closer to the Lord than we understand. And that, perhaps, was the most chilling part. The suffering wasn't hidden. It was revered. Penance was encouraged in all forms, fasting beyond what was required, self-flagellation, never openly condoned but never quite condemned either. Some monks tied cords too tightly around their waists to remind themselves of discipline. Others placed small stones in their sandals. These acts weren't required. They were gifts of devotion, but in truth they were acts of desperation. Men trying to feel something that wasn't guilt. Martin tried not to judge them. After all, he understood the impulse. There were days he woke and felt nothing but a dull grey weight pressing into his chest. No joy, no anger, no clarity, just a fog of self-loathing, too subtle to name, too familiar to question. He told himself it was spiritual dryness, a phase, a trial. But somewhere deep down, he feared it was something else, a slow erosion, a fading. He often wondered, if you punish a soul long enough, does it become holy, or does it just stop trying? That question, of course, was unaskable. The rule did not entertain doubt. The abbot certainly didn't. And so it remained inside him, unspoken. Just another piece of unconfessed guilt waiting to be translated into a longer prayer or a shorter meal. And through it all, the monastery remained silent. Not peaceful, just silent. Brother Martin had grown accustomed to watching the slow unravelling of other men. He'd seen the quiet descent from zeal into obsession, from discipline into numbness, and from humility into hollow-eyed despair. But the real horror lay not in the collapse, but in how normal it became. How the monastery absorbed suffering like old stone absorbed moisture, silently, without stain, without protest. The walls didn't remember, but the men inside did. There was a saying passed among the more thoughtful monks, muttered only in the garden shadows or behind the infirmary, Too much penance is a form of madness God forgot to name. You'd never find it in Scripture. You'd certainly never hear the abbot say it. But every monk knew it was true. The line between sanctity and delusion was not a thick iron gate. It was a fine, cracking thread. Brother Zygmunt had been one of the brightest. A brilliant Latinist, quick-witted even within the required limits of speech, and a naturally graceful singer. His presence had once brought light to the refectory, a rare thing. Then one day he began fasting outside the schedule, not excessively at first, just minor abstentions, skipping bread, passing on a ladle of soup. When asked, he only smiled and said, "My appetite was too loud." It escalated. He stopped sleeping on his cot, choosing instead the stone floor near the chapel door. He confessed more frequently, sometimes twice a day, detailing imagined sins in excruciating detail. Once he admitted to harbouring envy toward a bird that had flown past the window during sext, because its wings were not bound to vows. The abbot listened, nodded, and said nothing. That was how it always began, the slow descent met with solemn silence. Eventually, Zygmunt's eyes lost their focus. His skin greyed. He began murmuring penitential psalms even during work, repeating lines like incantations. "My sin is always before me. My bones are crushed with guilt," over and over, as if the words themselves were ropes keeping him tethered to the world. One evening he vanished. Found in the punishment cell the next morning, kneeling in the dark, refusing food, whispering fragments of scripture to the wall. The monks were told he had taken a personal retreat to be closer to God. No one ever said the word madness. That would have been uncharitable. But Martin remembered the look in Zygmunt's eyes before he went silent. Not passion, not faith, but fear. As if he had finally realized that the cage he'd built around himself was not made of sin, but of obedience taken too far. This was the cost of unchecked penance, when guilt becomes not a guidepost, but a god. And yet, the monastery encouraged it in 1,000 subtle ways. Praise was lavished on those who punished themselves. A monk who chose the hardest tasks was admired. One who wept during confession was a vessel of true contrition. One who broke down sobbing at the feet of the abbot during prayers was whispered about for days, with awe, as if witnessing a private miracle. Meanwhile, those who held steady, who smiled cautiously, who expressed even a hint of contentment, were treated with vague suspicion. Brother Martin sometimes felt like he was walking a spiritual minefield. Stray too far into visible suffering, and you risked losing yourself. Stay too balanced, and you risked being seen as proud. The safe space, the honest space, barely existed. The monastery didn't want serenity. It wanted suffering, but neatly arranged, sanctified, contained. It didn't help that the language of Scripture itself reinforced this. Psalm after psalm spoke of sin, punishment, unworthiness. The chants were full of tears, of repentance, of begging. Rarely did they speak of joy except as a vague afterthought to suffering. God was described not as a friend, but as a righteous judge. And every monk learned early that the court of that judge started inside your own head. Martin once tried to discuss this with Brother Tamás, his mentor, and one of the few monks still capable of conversation not bound by rote. He asked carefully, "Do you think it's possible to feel too guilty?" Tamás had paused for a long time, running one wrinkled thumb across the edge of a wooden bench, then replied quietly, "Only if you're still sane." It was meant as a warning. Or maybe a confession. Even confession, that supposed cleansing ritual, had become performative. You didn't just speak your sins. You were expected to weep, to shake, to lower your voice to a trembling whisper. The abbot never demanded this, but the monastery rewarded it. It meant you were close to the wound. It meant you were still moldable. Some monks staged their confessions like theatre. Brother Joseph would often enter the confession chamber with red eyes, even if nothing had happened. He had learned to twist his voice with just enough brokenness to seem holy. Martin didn't blame him. Sincerity had become risky. Performance was safer. You could confess a lie and feel cleaner than if you'd told the truth with the wrong tone. And yet, amidst all this, no one spoke openly of mental illness. The language didn't exist for it. There were no monks with anxiety or depression. There were only monks who were deep in trial or under spiritual shadow. Those who broke weren't treated. They were redirected, quietly, permanently. A few monks disappeared entirely. Officially, they'd been sent to other monasteries or called elsewhere by God's will. Martin doubted most of those letters ever existed. He once asked the infirmarian monk, Brother Imra, about these cases. The old man shrugged and said, "Some men find God by crawling through fire. Others burn up before they reach him." That night, Martin couldn't sleep. He lay on his plank, staring into the rafters, wondering if his own guilt had become something alive, something that paced the corridors of his mind when the bell stopped ringing, something that fed on silence, that grew stronger every time he swallowed a feeling instead of speaking it. And if it was alive, could it be killed? Or had he already built it a home? Chapter 10, Scribes and Spies, Politics in the Pews. It was one of the great myths of monastic life that once a man crossed the cloister gate, he left behind the world. That power, ambition, jealousy, competition, these belonged to the marketplace and the court, not to a place of prayer. But behind the sandstone arches and scriptural chants, beneath the layers of ritual and discipline, another system thrived. A quieter one, a colder one. The monastery had no throne, but it had politics. And it had spies. Brother Martin first noticed it in the way conversations changed when certain monks entered a room, the way glances darted, the way laughter stiffened, or how work suddenly became more meticulous when a particular footstep echoed in the hallway. Everyone claimed to be equals here, brothers under God, but everyone also knew who had influence, who carried favour, and more importantly, who listened. It wasn't betrayal in the dramatic sense. No one was sneaking documents to kings or selling secrets to rival abbeys. But information had value. A careless comment in the scriptorium about Father Miklos's increasingly strict fasts might reach his ears within the day. A whispered joke about Brother Istvan's voice cracking during chant rehearsal could earn you double latrine duty by week's end. The punishment would arrive gently, wrapped in protocol. But the message beneath was always clear. Nothing said was ever forgotten. It began, as most institutional rot does, with the scribes. Copying manuscripts might sound like dull labour to the outsider, just ink and repetition. But within the monastery, the scriptorium was more than a workplace. It was a power centre. The monks who worked there had access to everything: rule books, private letters, inventory logs, even correspondence with nobles or bishops. Some copied the rule of St. Benedict so many times they could recite whole chapters by memory. Others transcribed letters from the abbot's desk with eyes that never blinked. Knowledge passed through them, and they remembered. Brother Tamas had warned Martin early. The pen may be humble, but the hand behind it is rarely so. It was true. The scribes knew who favoured who was late to prayer, who ate more than their share of barley. They didn't gossip. That would be too obvious. But they let things slip in carefully chosen confessions or in commentary passed during chapter readings, all within the bounds of decorum, all sanctified by concern. There were favourites, of course. Brother Benedict, though only 30, held influence that reached the abbot's chair. His script was flawless, his piety well performed, and his ears always open. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it was often to clarify something another monk had said. His corrections were always polite, his tone always gentle, but his words were nails. You learned to speak carefully around him, or not at all. Some monks tried to play the game, to curry favour. They offered compliments, volunteered for shared duties, lingered near the senior monks during mealtimes. It was subtle, but not invisible. You could see it in the way they nodded too quickly during sermons, or how their voices grew louder during chant, as if piety could be proven by volume. The monastery didn't reward pride outright, but it remembered who was useful. Brother Martin did not play, not because he was especially virtuous, but because he didn't know how. His mind wasn't sharp in that way. He copied what he was given, sang as he was told, obeyed when spoken to, and still he felt the eyes, the measuring, the weighing. He suspected that even his silence was being tracked. But it wasn't just monks spying on monks. There was the Abbot's system, an invisible network of informants never identified, always feared. They weren't appointed publicly. You were never told who they were, but they existed. You knew by how precisely the abbot responded to murmurs never said aloud. If a monk whispered about the dried-out candles, the next night they'd be replaced. If someone questioned the bread portions, a sermon on gratitude would follow. It was as if the walls themselves had ears. And maybe they did. Brother Imre, the infirmarian, once hinted quietly while crushing dried sage that every monastery had listening mouths. Not all spies are wicked, he said. Some think they're protecting the flock. He didn't name names. He didn't need to. This surveillance culture bred a strange kind of spiritual paranoia. You began second-guessing every word, every breath. Was that cough during the psalm too loud? Was your tone during confession too casual? Did someone hear your stomach growl during the vigil? Even your dreams, if spoken aloud, could become evidence against you. The mind was no longer private. It was territory under observation. Even the liturgical readings were subtly shaped by politics. The abbot controlled the schedule. If murmurs about excessive fasting began to rise, suddenly the readings were filled with stories of saints who lived on air and sunlight. If talk of the outer world crept into conversation, the sermons pivoted to the dangers of vanity and pride. Scripture wasn't just spiritual, it was political reinforcement. And then there were the elections. Every year, certain roles rotated: head of the gardens, choir leader, refectory overseer, theoretically democratic. In practice, they were appointments disguised as votes. The brothers would gather, cast their stones in silence, and somehow the same monks, always the favoured ones, were selected. No one questioned the outcomes. To challenge the system was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny, in this place, could unravel you. Brother Martin once considered leaving. Just once. The thought came during a particularly bitter winter, when food was scarce and tempers shorter than usual. He stood by the cloister gate during his assigned hour of watch and stared beyond it, into the trees, into freedom. The road beyond was covered in snow, silent, unguarded. He could have walked, but he didn't, because he knew the monastery would remember, not through punishment, but through pressure, reassignment, isolation, suspicion. His duties would change, his confessor would shift. The chants assigned to him would be darker, heavier, more penitential, and no one would say why. No one would acknowledge the change. That was how the monastery kept control, by making you believe it didn't have to. In the end, Martin turned back toward the courtyard. The candles were being lit for Vespers. The air smelled of wet stone and stale wax. Another day, another step deeper into the quiet machine. And behind every bowed head and whispered chant, someone was always listening. It was sometime in late Lent when Brother Martin began to feel the invisible hand. It didn't grip or shove, it pressed. Softly. Relentlessly. He wasn't being punished. Not in any official way. There was no fasting order, no public rebuke, no new assignment to the latrines. But something had shifted. His place in the choir was moved, further from the cantor and closer to the novices. His reading duties ceased without explanation. During mealtimes, his name was skipped in discussions. Not intentionally, not cruelly, just missed, forgotten by men trained to remember everything. This was how the monastery corrected those who had not erred quite enough to justify punishment, but too much to be trusted. A spiritual quarantine. Social penance. You remained in the room, but your voice didn't echo the same way. Your footsteps weren't heard. The communal rhythm kept playing, but your part in the music was subtly detuned. He tried to tell himself it was imagination, that the coldness he felt in Brother Istvan's gaze, the way his shoulder was no longer touched in passing blessing, the small delay in getting supplies from the kitchen, These were accidents. But then came the questions. Brother Benedict approached him during garden duty, polite, smiling. "I've heard you've been spending longer hours in solitary prayer," he said. "That's admirable. But remember, humility is best when witnessed by God, not the brothers." Martin hadn't prayed longer than usual. Later that week, the abbot's steward stopped him during refectory clean-up. "Have your dreams been troubling you?" he asked. Many find that silence invites temptation. Martin hadn't mentioned dreams to anyone, and in confession Father Miklos asked, "Are you feeling tired, brother? You haven't smiled much of late." A heavy heart is a doorway for pride. That was the final proof. He hadn't smiled in days, true. But how had the abbot noticed? Unless someone had told him. Someone had been watching, not in malice, not with knives, but with concern sharpened into control. It wasn't just the abbot who ruled here. It was the network. The monastery functioned on information, not food, not prayer, not discipline, but data. Who was weak? Who was loyal? Who was a threat? Who might become one? Not to the faith, but to the structure. The strange part was how normal it felt after a while. You began to self-edit. Not just what you said, but how you walked. How you held your bowl. How loudly you breathed during chanting. You polished yourself until only the approved shape remained. And when your own thoughts strayed, too critical, too curious, you corrected them preemptively. You became your own informant. Even friendship became a kind of negotiation. Martin had once felt close to Brother Tamas. They shared jokes during weeding, exchanged psalter margins with silly scribbles during long hours. But that too began to cool. Tamas no longer sought him out in the cloister walk. During group work, he volunteered to be stationed elsewhere. He smiled, still but distantly. And when they did speak, it was always careful, brief, and mostly about the weather which never changed. That was the most effective weapon the monastery wielded, ambiguity. There were no arrests, no public shaming, no lists, just shifts. A cough that lingered, a seat that changed, a role lost. It was enough to make you question your memory. Had you misread that look? Had you truly been reassigned, or did you misunderstand the schedule? Did someone else hear what you muttered under your breath, or did you only imagine speaking aloud? And over time, doubt turned inward. Brother Martin caught himself in these spirals, replaying conversations, rehearsing apologies never needed, preparing confessions for sins not yet committed. He began watching his own shadow, certain it had grown too tall, too independent. He dreamt of rooms with no doors, of psalters with blank pages, of monks chanting words he didn't recognize in voices that sounded like his own. He stopped speaking unless spoken to. His chanting grew flatter, his handwriting more rigid, his smiles mechanical. And in this muted performance he found safety. Because safety was not found in God, it was found in invisibility. The monastery didn't need to torture you to control you. It didn't need to excommunicate. It just needed to make you question your belonging. To remind you, through absence and delay, that you were being watched, and that the eye of judgment did not blink. Yet, beneath this polished obedience, something inside Martin twitched, a seed of unease. Not rebellion, not defiance, just a quiet wondering, what if none of this was holy? What if the structure he had surrendered himself to wasn't a ladder to God, but a circle drawn in stone, tight, unbreakable, and closing slowly around his soul? There were moments, rare but sharp, when he considered speaking, not to the abbot, not to a confessor, but to someone outside. A travelling friar, a visiting merchant, someone who could see the monastery from the outside and name what it had become. But he never did, because even that thought, hope, felt like a betrayal. And so he stayed, performed, hid the questions behind his teeth and the ache behind bowed shoulders. Let the invisible hand keep pressing until he no longer noticed the weight. And as the candles burned low in the chapel and the psalms drifted upward into the vaulted ceiling like smoke, Brother Martin sang, softly, carefully, exactly as he was expected to, Chapter 11. Ghosts in the Garden. Monks who disappeared. There were always fewer monks in the garden than there used to be. No one said so aloud. The monastery didn't speak of numbers, only silence and service and divine order. But Brother Martin had been counting, not with ink or parchment, but with memory. Faces that once moved through the cloister now lingered only in brief flashes. A crooked smile during chant, a limp beneath the habit, the way someone always arrived last to Compline. And then, it never happened all at once. They didn't disappear in the night with torn robes or blood on the altar steps. That would have been easy to notice. No. The vanishing was gradual, almost polite. A monk would fall ill, withdraw, be reassigned to solitary duties, or sent, vaguely, to another house to recover or reflect. Days later, their name would be missing from the lectors' list. Their bowl would not be set in the refectory. No one would speak their name, not in scorn, not in mourning. Only the birds in the garden seemed to remember, chirping nervously when too much silence settled. Martin used to think these disappearances were coincidental. Monks came and went. Death was common in a place where wounds festered, where cold pressed into bones, and where guilt drained men more surely than any illness. But now he wasn't sure. There was a pattern to the vanished. Not the weak ones, not the rebels, the thoughtful ones. The ones who asked questions with their eyes. The ones who looked too long at the chapel windows, as though they saw something beyond the stone. The first was Brother Paul, a gardener known for humming softly while planting beets. One day, Martin was assigned to help him weed a patch of struggling onions. They spoke little, but as they worked, Paul said something Martin never forgot. Every year we rip out weeds to make room for new life. But here, it seems the weeds are the ones who stay. It was said lightly, even with a smile. But a week later, Paul had vanished. The abbot explained he had gone to assist a struggling priory to the north. No letters came, no mention followed. Then there was Brother Levente, a bookbinder with hands so steady they seemed born for parchment. He had a habit of pausing during morning prayers, eyes unfocused, as if listening to something the rest could not hear. Once, Martin found him in the cloister garden alone, whispering psalms out of order. "They make more sense this way," he said. That was the last time they spoke. By Sunday his bed was stripped, his desk cleared. Even the birds had changed by then, nesting in the eaves more cautiously, taking flight too quickly, leaving feathers where once there were songs. The monastery never mourned the lost. Death itself was acknowledged, yes, with a short liturgy, the tolling of the old iron bell, a perfunctory prayer for the soul. But absence without death, that was treated as impolite. You were not to ask. If someone was gone, it meant God had moved them elsewhere, or that they had failed and thus erased themselves from the narrative. Neither version left room for grief, but Martin grieved them anyway, quietly, while tending the cabbages, while trimming the rosemary bushes, while kneeling in the chapel and chanting psalms he barely believed in. He grieved them in the way he now carried himself, a little slower, a little more careful, a little less visible, because he feared he might vanish too. One night, during a heavy fog, he wandered the garden alone. It was a forbidden hour after Compline, before matins. The monastery slept, or pretended to. The fog hugged the ground, curling around the herb beds like smoke. Martin walked among the rows of half-frozen mint and thyme, letting his fingers brush the leaves. The scent clung to his skin, sharp, real, alive. And then he saw it, or thought he did. A figure hunched near the edge of the garden wall, robbed, motionless, not working, not praying, just standing there like a statue that had never quite finished becoming human. Martin blinked. The fog shifted. The figure was gone. He told no one, because what could he say? I saw a ghost? I saw a brother who wasn't there? I saw my future? That week, another monk vanished, Brother Demokos. A novice, barely 20, with a stammer and a soft singing voice. No explanation was offered. His sandals remained by his bed for a day before they were quietly removed. And Martin began to wonder, was the monastery culling itself? Not with knives or flames, but with silence. Was this what happened to those who didn't break, but bent in the wrong direction? Who leaned too far toward thought, toward doubt? There were no public executions, no trials, just a slow disappearance of the inconvenient. And those left behind were expected to accept it, to fill the gaps in the chant, to scrub the absent names from the rosters, to pray louder for the missing without naming them. Sometimes, during solitary prayer, Martin would close his eyes and imagine them. Pal, tending a garden somewhere far from surveillance. Levente, reordering psalms in the woods, building a chapel from memory. Demokos, singing freely, stammer forgotten. And sometimes he imagined the opposite. That they were here still, beneath the cloister floor, behind the locked infirmary door, in the walls, not dead, just erased. And when he opened his eyes, the chapel always looked the same, perfect, still, empty in ways that could not be spoken. The monastery never locked its doors, but some rooms might as well have been sealed with iron. There were places you simply didn't go, not because it was forbidden, but because no one else did. The old apothecary room near the crypt, the west stairwell that creaked despite no one walking it, the northern alcove of the scriptorium, where Brother Levente had once been seen weeping quietly without cause, a month before his reassignment. These spaces were not cursed, not openly. They were just forgotten, conveniently, willfully. Brother Martin had grown sensitive to these invisible barriers. You learned them the way a deer learns which part of the forest leads to wolves, not through signs, but absence. And in the monastery, absence spoke louder than scripture. Where there should have been warmth, there was cold. Where there should have been voices, there was dust. And where there should have been names, there was only the soft hush of collective forgetting. Some monks, in time, began referring to the vanished ones indirectly. A brother would say, "We are fewer now," and another would reply, "Yes, the Lord prunes his vineyard. No names, no grief, just metaphor and resignation. It was easier that way. Safer. Mourning was for the outside world. Here you buried memory with silence." But Martin remembered them. In the way Brother Pal used to adjust his robe before sitting, a small compulsive gesture of self-respect. In the uneven stitch on Levente's scapula, the result of his poor eyesight and stubborn pride. In the soft tune Demokos hummed while sweeping, the same three notes, over and over, like a moth tracing light in the dark. He remembered. And remembering, in a place that demanded forgetfulness, was its own quiet form of rebellion. One overcast morning, while fetching rosemary from the far end of the garden, Martin paused beside the old well. It hadn't been used in years. A newer one had been dug closer to the kitchen. This one was cracked, the stones chipped, moss crawling across its rim. He peered inside, nothing but shadow and a faint scent of wet earth. But etched along the stone was something strange, a name, faint, nearly worn away by rain and time. He squinted, PL, and then nothing. Perhaps it was a coincidence, perhaps it wasn't. He said nothing. That day, during Sext, Brother Miklos the Abbot himself delivered the reading. His voice was calm, perfectly modulated, as always. The passage was from the Psalms. The wicked are snared by the work of their hands. The way of the wicked will perish. He did not look at Martin as he said it, and yet Martin felt his throat tighten. He wondered briefly if remembering made you wicked here. Later, in the dormitory, he noticed a change. Brother Thomas no longer spoke to him, even in passing. The steward who once brought him ink now waited for him to collect it instead. He was not punished, no extra chores, no sermon, just space. Cold space. The kind that said, "Be careful where your thoughts wander." And still his mind wandered. He couldn't help it. He began keeping mental track of who stopped showing up to morning prayer, who stood in a different place during Lauds, who smiled less. It became a kind of internal ledger, not out of paranoia, but out of need. If the monastery was forgetting, someone had to remember. Someone had to see the gaps, the quiet edits to the living manuscript of their days. But the weight of knowing was heavy. He dreamt often now, of footsteps echoing in empty cloisters, of mouths that opened to chant and made no sound, of robes folded neatly on a bench with nobody to wear them. Sometimes he woke and couldn't remember if he'd ever truly spoken with Brother Pal. Had they actually gardened together, or had he imagined it? Had Domikos really hummed, or was that song something Martin had invented to fill the silence? Gaslighting yourself was the monastery's greatest trick. It didn't erase you with violence. It just waited for you to doubt your own memory. There were no markers for the lost, no gravestones, no plaques. But sometimes, in the garden, Martin thought he saw signs. A trowel left at an odd angle. A patch of thyme that seemed trimmed more carefully than the others. Feathers clustered around a bench like the site of a quiet struggle. And once, carved into the underside of the chapel bench, he found a single word scratched with what must have been a nail or the edge of a spoon, remember. He didn't show it to anyone. He didn't even touch it. He just sat a little straighter during the next chant, a little louder, a little more deliberately. Not to draw attention, but to stay visible, because he was beginning to believe that invisibility was a choice the monastery sometimes made for you. That forgetting, like obedience, could be forced. And so, Martin remembered, not with loud words or rebellion, but with presence. He spoke the names silently during his prayers, even when they weren't saints. He imagined their voices layered into the chants, harmonizing with the living. He kept their faces alive in his mind like pressed leaves in a book no one else could see. And when, inevitably, another monk went missing, Brother Mixer, this time quiet and precise, gone without explanation, Martin stood a little longer in the cloister that evening, letting the wind tangle his robe. He didn't speak, didn't cry, just stood, anchoring someone in the world who no longer had a name, because in a monastery built on silence, remembering was the loudest thing you could do. Chapter 12. When Faith Becomes Fear. The final toll. There is a point in monastic life where faith stops being a comfort and starts becoming a weight. At first, it's subtle, like too many stones in a pocket. You feel heavier during prayer. You start kneeling with more hesitation. Psalms you once murmured with conviction now land on your tongue like ash. The rituals remain the same, precise, clean, sacred, but inside something begins to rot. And because you're trained not to look inward too long, you never quite see where the decay begins. By spring, Brother Martin had reached that point. The days had begun to lengthen, but it brought no relief. If anything, the light seemed crueler, exposing the cracks in the chapel walls, the wear on the monks' faces, the fatigue in their movements. The sun came through the clerestory windows, not as a blessing, but like interrogation. Where once it had illuminated the altar in gold, now it cast sharp shadows on the worn floor, slicing the sanctuary into lines that felt more like barriers than blessings. Something had shifted inside him. Not a dramatic break, but a quiet corrosion. He still followed every instruction, still bowed at every bell, still recited his chants. But he no longer believed they were leading anywhere. Prayer had become performance. Confession felt like theatre. The monastery had always been strict, but now it felt hollow. The sacred shell, beautiful on the outside, echoing with ghosts on the inside. The irony, of course, was that no one noticed, because he looked perfect, obedient, quiet, diligent. In a world where outward conformity was everything, that was enough to keep the wolves at bay. Even the abbot passed him without pause now. No extra penance, no correction. Perhaps, in his perfection, Martin had finally disappeared. But invisibility wasn't peace. It was suffocation. He had started waking early, long before the bell. Sitting on the cold stone floor of his cell, waiting for the sound that marked yet another day. Those hours were the worst. Before duty could drown him, before the rituals resumed, he would sit with his thoughts, and his thoughts would sit with him, like vultures on a branch. And the worst of them, the one that grew larger each day, was this. What if this isn't God? What if we're kneeling before a structure, not a saviour? What if all this pain, this guilt, this silence, this controlled self-erasure isn't holy discipline, but simply fear disguised as virtue? He tried to silence the thought, repeated psalms until they lost meaning, fasted until his body trembled, asked forgiveness for questions he hadn't dared to speak, but the thought remained, not loud, just constant. The monastery had no room for doubt. Doubt was a threat, not to theology, but to the system. One honest question could shake the scaffolding. So they trained it out of you, smoothed it over with rules and reverence. Doubt became sin. Sin required penance. Penance consumed the soul, until the only thing left was obedience. And obedience was easier than faith, because faith demanded vulnerability, openness, risk. Obedience just needed silence. One afternoon, while weeding the rosemary beds, Martin found a dead bird, small, grey, tucked under a bush as if trying to escape the cold. He stared at it for a long time. Something about the image, fragile wings folded neatly, eyes open but lifeless, gripped him. He didn't bury it. He just covered it with leaves and returned to his work, the scent of crushed herbs clinging to his hands. That night, he dreamt he was chanting alone, not in the chapel, but in a field surrounded by fog. Every time he tried to stop, someone whispered, "Again." He obeyed. His mouth moved. No sound came out. The fog thickened. The voice whispered again. When he awoke, his throat was sore. He went to prayer. He sang as always. But something had gone missing from the sound. Brother Tammuz noticed it first. After service, he touched Martin's arm and said, "You've gone quiet, even when you're loud," then walked away, no further explanation. That evening, Martin wandered into the cloister alone. The moon was full, painting the stone walk in silver and shadow. He stood beneath the old fig tree, now bare, skeletal, and let the cold bite through his robe. He didn't pray. He just stood there, feeling the wind tug at him like a question. He didn't want to leave. He didn't want to stay. He just wanted the noise inside him to stop. And in that moment, he finally understood the monks who had disappeared. Not the logistics of it, but the impulse, the slow erosion that leads a man to the edge. The hunger to feel something again, even if that something is silence unshaped by doctrine. He looked up at the chapel roof, outlined against the stars, and whispered a line from Psalm 88. "Why, Lord, do you reject me and hide your face from me?" No answer. Not that he expected one. He returned to his cell, laid on the plank, stared at the ceiling. He didn't sleep, but for the first time in weeks he didn't dream either. The bells rang, as they always did, clear, cold, and without mercy. They pulled the monks from sleep, from thought, from whatever corners of themselves they'd managed to retreat into during the hours of darkness. Brother Martin stood before the sound reached its second toll. He hadn't slept. The wood beneath him no longer registered as discomfort. It was simply what was. The pain in his knees, the stiffness in his shoulders. It was part of the uniform now, like his robe, like the shaved crown of his head. He touched neither. He simply stood, moved, breathed. He had stopped asking for anything in his prayers. Not clarity, not comfort, not even forgiveness. Somewhere along the path he had realized that prayer was not a conversation, it was a performance. And if God had been listening, he'd said nothing back. The morning light in the chapel was soft, pale, empty. The psalms echoed through the stone like wind through an abandoned room. Martin sang each word with perfect rhythm, perfect pitch, and no belief. His voice was full, but hollow, like a vessel cracked clean through the centre, able to hold shape, but nothing more. Across the aisle, Brother Benedek watched him with that usual unblinking calm. Others watched too, not openly, just enough to notice that Martin no longer smiled, no longer hesitated, no longer seemed human. That was the secret the monastery never spoke. If you survived long enough, you became a ghost that hadn't left yet. Brother Martin didn't feel anger. That had died months ago. He didn't feel sorrow either. That required the energy to miss something. What he felt now was distance. From the rule, from the chants, from the God he had once tried so hard to impress. His life had become a shadow that moved through the rhythms of holiness, without touching any of it. He washed, bowed, ate, copied, fasted, and none of it reached him anymore. And yet no one stopped him, because from the outside he was everything a monk should be. The more broken he became inside, the more sacred he looked outside. It was, in its own way, a kind of perfection. That evening he returned to the garden. The rosemary had begun to bloom again, faint purple blossoms trembling against the wind. He ran his fingers along them without thought, let the scent cling to him like a memory. In the centre of the garden was the bench, the one near the old fig tree, where once he'd imagined a brother's voice still humming beneath the earth. He sat, he breathed, and he began to recite, not the psalms, not the rule, but the names, one by one. Pal, Levente, Domikos, Mixa. He said them aloud, softly, with no ceremony, no ritual, just memory. The monastery might forget them, but he wouldn't, not because he was brave, because it was the last thing inside him that still felt real. A shadow moved past the cloister gate, Brother Tamas's perhaps, or just the wind. Martin didn't look. He didn't care if someone heard, if the abbot questioned him, if the eyes behind every corridor window marked him down for erasure. He had already disappeared. He just hadn't left yet. That night he didn't return to his cell. Instead he knelt in the chapel, in the space where the moonlight fell across the altar. He did not fold his hands. He did not pray. He just knelt. And for the first time in all the years of silence, he finally felt something again, not faith, not fear, but grief, not for himself, for all of them, for what they had given up, for what they had never received, for the men who had carved out their hearts in pursuit of a God who never once answered. And as the candlelight flickered, casting tall shadows across stone and scripture, Brother Martin whispered a final line, not from the Psalms, but from somewhere deeper, unrecorded. I was faithful, and I was afraid. And that should have never been the same thing. Sometimes I wonder what kind of faith survives by suffocating the very soul it's meant to save. We read about monasteries and think of quiet, holy places of peace, of purpose, of men devoted to something bigger than themselves. But what we often forget is that in places like this, like that Hungarian monastery, faith was not always a refuge. Sometimes it was a cage. And the monks? They weren't always pilgrims. They were prisoners of ritual, of fear, of silence. What strikes me most isn't the discipline. Discipline can be noble. Structure can be grounding. But what we saw in that story wasn't structure. It was slow erosion, disguised as obedience. Guilt weaponized. Silence mistaken for virtue. And the most dangerous part? Everyone believed it was holy. The abbot never raised his voice. He didn't need to. The system did the punishing. The rule of St. Benedict, once meant to bring order to chaos, had hardened into something else. A script with no room for improvisation. A map with no exit. If I had been there, if we had lived in that time, what could we have done differently? We wouldn't have had psychology, no vocabulary for depression, no scientific understanding of the mind. But we did have reason. We did have human instinct. We had herbs, music, conversation, and most of all, we had each other. So if I had been there, I wouldn't have tried to rewrite the rule, but I would have broken it when it broke people. I would have sat longer with the monks who whispered questions. I would have made remembering the disappeared an act of daily prayer. I would have tended the garden not as penance, but as therapy. I would have let laughter live, even if the abbot disapproved. I would have dared to say, maybe the God we fear is not the God we need, and maybe the holiest thing a monk can do is admit that he's suffering. Because here's the truth. A monastery that forgets mercy is no better than a prison. And faith that punishes doubt is no different than tyranny. In the end, that Hungarian monk, Martin, didn't rebel. He didn't run, but he remembered. And in a world built on silence, memory is a quiet form of resistance. And if I had been there, I'd have remembered too. And I'd have whispered his name in every chant until someone, anyone dared to say it out loud.